Ladies and gentlemen, today is November 26, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world. That means current events, foreign policy, economics, all of this during the amazing Neuro Subathon 3. You can see the goals over here. Without any further delays, we will see what Agent Smith has to say about all of these matters and receive some of your questions. We begin with world discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing pretty well. Yourself?
I'm stuffed with Thanksgiving leftovers.
Ah. He's doing the
pretty
post-feast. Nice.
Oh, yeah. Lots of pie.
Which kinds of pie?
Pumpkin pie, for the most part.
Nice.
With whipped cream.
It's gonna be one of the classics for sure.
Oh, yeah. And all the rest, too. You know, all the turkey and macaroni and cheese and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Macaroni and cheese. I don't usually see that as a Thanksgiving mainstay, but it's an American food for sure.
Well, you know, some of the family like to spruce it up and add meat and cheese. Well, obviously it comes with cheese, but I mean like melted cheese laying on top of it. So, you know, there's different ways to cook it that kind of make it fancy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, blue-collar junk food fancy. Still not healthy, but a little more interesting than your basic Kraft mac and cheese that you might have normally.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, very fattening week overall.
Well, hope you had a good time with family and fellowship.
Oh, yeah. Everybody was there.
Nice. I had a Thanksgiving with friends. I have a fellow streamer who just lives like 15-minute run or a 5-minute drive away, and I was hanging out there. We went to see a drone metal show on Wednesday night, and that was definitely different from most concerts I've been to because the nature of it being music might be somewhat contested by people who went to it. The beats per minute of the music is so slow that it's sort of like they'll just hold one note for a minute and then they'll switch to a different note just by one half step. So it's the way I described it was it kind of sounds like a person going crazy with a leaf blower on an airplane, like right at the back next to the engines. That's kind of what it sounds like. And there isn't any vocalist. There was no drummer. There was no bass player. It was just two guitarists with super loud speakers. Very interesting concept. Apparently these artists are like revered, and people who are into the drone metal scene think that it's like some of the coolest stuff ever. So more power to them if that's what you're into. But for me as a first timer, it was definitely weird and very avant-garde. I was like, it's so brave that they didn't play a single note for this whole time.
It sounds loud.
Yeah, it's very loud. That was one of the recommendations given by a viewer who's seen them live before, was wear earplugs. Yep. It looks like a big Stonehenge of speakers around the band. They have a lot more speakers than your usual artist group, and a bunch of smoke machines and stuff. Yeah, it's called drone metal, I guess, because it kind of drones on, and it makes sounds that robots might make if they were making music for each other. Another visual that I got was it's kind of like an Empire Sith base, and this is what the robots listen to in their spare time.
There you go.
Yeah.
Huh. Is there some new technology that's kind of behind that they're taking advantage of, or are they just experimenting?
We have Fuzzy Cord in chat. He's smart in the ways of audio. He could probably say better than I could if they're doing anything particularly different. I do know that the distortion of the sounds that they make is very high, so even though they play guitars, it doesn't really make you think guitar when you hear the sound that they make. So they have, I think, a lot of effects pedals and stuff like that that they use to modify the sound.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that I read a lot of the unique sound of 80s music just came from the fact that the technology behind synthesizers had gotten to a point where they were much cheaper and readily available, and
Mm-hmm.
also much more capable than they had been before.
Mm-hmm.
And so their usage became ubiquitous. So I was wondering if maybe something similar wasn't happening now.
Yeah, the band is named after an amplifier, and that's one of the main themes of their music is just being incredibly loud. So
Mm. So this isn't like a genre, it's more just this one particular band.
it is a genre.
It is
The
a genre.
Yeah, the
Okay.
artist that played before the band had some similar effects. There's a genre called shoegaze, which is named after guitars that have a big effects pedal in front of them, and they're looking down at the pedals for most of the show because they're applying so many different effects to the sound.
Mm.
So the artists before that, they were more conventional in the format though, where they did have a percussionist and they did have a vocalist in the first band. So it was kind of like easing you into the just full on drone metal by starting out with stuff that was like adjacent to it sound wise, which is good in terms of concert planning. You want to make sure the opening acts sound at least somewhat similar to the main thing.
Mm.
Yeah, it was cool. I'm glad I went. It's not something that I would probably seek out on my own to like go to another one of those shows, but it's like cool that exists and there are people who are very excited about it. It was kind of funny because it's like an openly very nerdy crowd. There were some people who were like, "Hey, what's the score at the Kraken game?" And they were like, "Hockey sucks. Sports are dumb." And someone was like, "But hockey is the nerdiest sport." And then they got into an argument about what the nerdiest sport was. Some people in Twitch chat were like, "No, it's baseball." What is the nerdiest sport, chat? I won't be mad if you say
Yeah,
something in particular.
there's a lot of statistics involved in the baseball fandom, but I don't know how popular the statistical sort of analysis is amongst the broader fan base. I
No,
saw
it
some
just.
people on Reddit arguing about that a while back,
Mm-hmm.
about the relative importance of statistics to different parts of the baseball fan base.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to defer to Chad on that. I have not been a big baseball fan
Mm-hmm.
over the course of my life.
Growing up, we had a family tradition of going to the Texas Rangers game, getting bored, and then going to Six Flags for the rest of the evening. Because we had season passes, so if you get bored, why not? It's like right over there,
Yeah,
super close. But the Rangers won
pennant.
the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, they did for the first time ever.
Oh, really? They hadn't won before.
Oh no,
Hmm.
never. And they've been in the league since the 1950s.
Wow.
So it's a bit of an achievement for them. The fans were very happy. I was happy for them, even though I wasn't, even though I'm not like a big fan of the Rangers.
But you
And
are a Texan.
it was a pretty fun ride too, from what I heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
They in the conference final, I guess that's what it's called. I don't know, but in the NHL, you would call it a conference final. So in the baseball equivalent of a conference final, they beat their rivals, the Houston Astros, in a 7-game series,
Hmm.
which was pretty exciting. And then when it came to the actual championship series, they apparently swept the other team. Is that right? It's a best of 7, so
So they 4-0'd him?
I think so.
Wow.
Somebody in chat would know better than me, certainly. I honestly can't even remember who they were playing. Yeah,
Well
they
played
used
to
to
the
be.
Rangers.
Yeah, yeah. Did you know that they actually originated in Washington?
Washington State?
Washington, D.C.
Ooh.
Yeah, they were originally the Washington Nationals.
Huh. Did not know that.
Yeah, I think they played for like 10 years or something through the 50s, some of the 60s, and then they relocated to Dallas,
Hmm.
became the Texas Rangers.
cool. Did not know that.
Little random trivia.
Chat says Rangers and Diamondbacks was the matchup.
Oh, that's what it was. Thank you. Yeah, 2 Sun Belt teams.
So I did get some initial questions from chat just to see what was popping out in the news. Apparently, we launched the most powerful rocket ever, and it did blow up again, but after a longer period of time than the last big rocket, which I think they call Progress, which is good. I think it was SpaceX that was doing that.
Yeah, I think so. They do a fair bit of that.
What are these rockets for? Like, what would they use them for if they weren't testing them? Is this to shoot people to Mars or what?
Man, you'd have to ask somebody who follows it more closely than I do.
Hmm.
You know, for me, a lot of the technology that they're developing is interesting, but it's not really viable yet. Hence a lot of, hence the testing. You know, they do have commercially viable operations, but a lot of it is just really basic stuff like shooting satellites up into space and sending supplies to the International Space Station. Do they even do? They might not do that anymore, actually. I think they're going to decommission that space station pretty soon if they haven't already. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that they do. It's nothing too dramatic. But they have been working on larger rockets in order to help NASA with their moon mission that they've been working on. So if they can get these larger rockets to work, those will be what you see later on, if and when NASA ends up going to the moon again.
Oh yeah, it's saying they plan to decommission the International Space Station by 2030.
2030, okay. Maybe I was thinking of the Mir space station, because I'm pretty sure that was decommissioned and crashed into the ocean, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the International Space Station may go down in history as a high watermark for international cooperation. Or if maybe high watermark is too dramatic, but let's say it'll be symbolic. It'll be emblematic of the era in which it was built, when international cooperation was in the ascendant, was much more the norm than it is right now.
Yeah, don't they usually have like a representative from almost every spacefaring country that's up there at a time?
I don't know if they always have them up there, but I don't even know if they have enough crew up there to represent all of them at a given time. But the space station itself was constructed from modules that were built from each participating country, which encompassed most spacefaring nations, at least as of the 1990s. So Russia, the United States, the European Space Agency, Japan Space Agency, all of them contributed parts and modules to the International Space Station. So it was a real team effort. It was kind of meant to be representative of what could be accomplished with international cooperation. It was also meant to split the costs, amongst the larger base of nations. Like made it a little more affordable. So that was not a inconsiderable factor as well at play there. But it was kind of a feel-good project for a lot of people, especially people interested in space exploration and relevant research. It was a very cool project. I actually went down to Houston on a trip when I was a kid. This would have been like the year 1999, I guess, something around there. And I actually went to Houston Space Center. I don't remember the technical name of it, but they gave us a tour, and we got to kind of walk through one of the development labs they had. And I actually got to see the escape vehicle that they were working on. If anything goes wrong on the space station, they actually have like a little mini shuttle that acts as a kind of escape pod that the astronauts can get into and get back down to Earth. So they had I don't know if it was the same one they sent up, but at the very least they had some kind of model, full-sized model on the ground in the lab, which was very cool.
Nice. Chat saying that India just hit the moon in the southern hemisphere of it.
They did. They beat Russia.
Huh.
Russia was trying to do the same thing, and they were actually ahead of them in terms of scheduling. But when their probe, is that the right word? When their probe landed, they lost contact with it.
Oh no.
Yeah, yeah. So the Indians ended up winning that race, even though they were a little bit behind. Nice little come from behind win there for India.
Had Russia not landed on the moon with stuff before?
Yeah, they had,
Oh.
but they had not landed what on the dark side of the moon, something like that. Some particular thing that they had not, some specific thing that they had not done before, is what
Mm.
they were trying to do. I think it was landing on the dark side of the moon, but I would again defer to Chad on that. I'm sure they would know better. But India was trying to do the same thing at roughly the same time, and they were kind of in an informal race. They weren't actually racing with each other, but there was kind of a sort of mini contest to see who might be first, and it turned out to be India.
Well done to them.
Yeah. Yeah, you could say that Russia and India were in as much of a race to do it first as the United States and China are in a race right now to get back to the moon.
Which
So
is
kind of,
but not that much. Yeah, there isn't really
yeah,
that much at stake other than pride.
yeah,
Pride and
yeah,
bragging rights are at stake here.
yeah. The media doesn't even really follow it, which gives you an idea of just how important it is, quote unquote.
Well, the media followed the first journey to get a man on the moon.
Oh yeah,
That was a really big one. I feel like that kind of healthy competition between countries for spacefaring stuff is way better than us shooting at each other.
yeah.
So
Oh,
it's a
for sure.
good outlet for energy and creativity, and helps us to make cool technological stuff that's about
Mm.
getting people places rather than hurting people.
Well, that can change too, but yeah, it's always possible that we can militarize space,
It's
or
not a
even
gun,
more.
it's a space drill.
Yeah, we'll militarize it even more than we already have anyway. And
Mm.
there has been steps in that direction already. Yeah, I think I read a while ago that there's not really any established law regarding territorial claims on the moon, and that could be a problem later if there is, in the unlikely scenario that there is some kind of commercially viable activity that could happen on the moon. That could be a problem then later, because there you could end up with overlapping claims. But we're probably a long ways off from that regardless, so it probably won't be an issue for a while.
Mm. I think Antarctica is kind of like that, where no
Yeah.
one can claim it.
Yeah, there's an international treaty in which all signatories agree not to, well, let me be specific. They do not enforce their claims.
Mm.
That does not mean they do not have claims, nor does it mean that they have abandoned their claims, but they have agreed not to pursue them.
Mm.
So technically, Antarctica is a kind of international territory, which could be a problem, but the climate is so inhospitable that it's not. Organized criminals are not making their way to Antarctica to take advantage of the legal vacuum there. It's not really profitable. So yeah, the lack of legal specifics on that are not really at issue. But if you look, you actually can find maps that sort of illustrate what different parts of Antarctica are claimed by different nations. And they have not technically completely given up those claims. They're just letting them lie for the moment, as per the treaty that they signed. But that's kind of a tangent. The original question was SpaceX and the rockets. Yeah, that's about the extent of what I know about it. Like, I haven't followed it closely because the implications are not really that big right now. When the technology matures later on, as they do more testing and perfect it, there will be bigger repercussions at that point, because then you could see a much larger space industry than what we have right now. But at this juncture, there's not a whole lot happening, at least to my understanding. keep in mind, I'm an economist. I don't follow the technology that closely. In so much as I'm familiar with engineering, it's mostly by way of relatives who actually did, graduate with degrees in engineering or have worked in the field all their lives. So it's secondhand knowledge for me. Generally my focus is more on the economic significance of technological development. And again, has made a lot of big strides, but in terms of the overall impact, it's okay, but it's not groundbreaking yet either. And we'll see if that changes in the future. But for now, rockets are still exploding in the testing. So they've got a ways to go.
There were some people asking, maybe this is somewhat unrelated, but they're talking about guns and stuff in chat now, which is always a fun topic. They're asking how much money the U.S. has sent to Ukraine and Israel. And those are two kind of loaded and different situations, but I gave them the counter of how far back do you want to go, which is a classic, because I think we've been supporting Israel for a while, and I don't know how long we've supported Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the answer really does depend on when you want to start counting. I'm going to assume that they're asking how much money has been sent since the respective wars have started. So since February 22 in the case of Ukraine, and since October 23 for Israel. And if that's the case, correct me if I'm wrong, but if that is the case, then the overall amount is not all that much, especially for Israel. I think maybe 10 billion for Israel since the big Hamas raid in October. So not all that much really for them. For Ukraine, since the war with Russia started, I want to say it's something like $40 billion. I guess I don't have to guess. I could just look it up. But I think it's about $40 billion. So combined, it would come out to about 50, if I'm right. Let's see. Oh, more than that. Okay. Since the war began, the Biden administration and Congress have directed more than 75 billion in assistance to Ukraine.
And how does that rate to or relate to our overall stuff that we have? I just googled the USA GDP, which is 23 trillion as of 2021.
Crazy high. Yeah, there was a statistic I encountered a week or two ago, which blew my mind, which was that the U.S. economy has doubled over the past 10 years, which did not sound right to me. It didn't feel it. It doesn't feel like it's doubled, right? People complain constantly about conditions, the lack of employment, all these kinds of things, and in general, I'm kind of optimistic on the U.S. economy just because of the data. No ideological reason per se. Just the data is generally pretty favorable. But even I was pretty skeptical of that. But if you look into it, it actually did. It actually doubled over 10 years. Well, pretty wild. But yeah, how does it compare to GDP? Well, like you say, it's not much. Like 23 trillion relative to 75 billion. Like 75 billion is nothing in comparison. A better comparison would probably be the federal budget, which is probably more what people are thinking of when they're talking about comparing to available resources. And I think the total budget for 2022 was $1 trillion, I want to say. Budget 22. I was way off. 6 trillion. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty far off.
You said defense budget is 6 trillion?
No, the total budget. Total federal budget, fiscal year 22, $6 trillion. Yeah, maybe military spending was 1 trillion. The total budget was 6 trillion. Wow.
Yeah, chat's saying defense budget is 1 trillion.
$1 trillion. God damn. That's a lot of money, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we were kind of half joking at the beginning of the Ukraine war that the U.S. defense budget is equivalent to half of Russia's entire GDP.
That's pretty
That's
crazy.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. $6 trillion. What are these? I thought it had gone down, but I guess not. But even if it had been half, it still would have been way higher than $1 trillion. So that's on me. Regardless, total federal budget fiscal year 22, $6 trillion. Total aid to Ukraine thus far is 75 billion. So what would that be? Let's see. 6 trillion divided by 0.075. Am I doing that right? No, it would be 6 trillion. 1.25% of the total budget. Am I mathing correctly, chat? Having a degree in economics does not mean you're good at math. I very much got into economics in spite of math. It was kind of a challenge for me. I wanted to get better at it. Yeah, not that much overall, regardless. Pretty affordable.
When we're talking on these massive scales of the highest spender when it comes to defense spending. That's one of the interesting things that sports will put caps on, which is how much each team can spend on their roster. And kind of looking at that from a military perspective, there isn't a cap per se. So a given country can spend as much as they want on military as long as their government and people support it or can't stop it.
Yeah, so long as you've got political will and the money, you can ramp up that budget as much as you want. But there are generally limits in that regard.
And then for the US, like it's going to be really easy to spend massive sums of money because advanced planes are one of the things that we love to make, and those are turbo expensive.
Sorry, what?
Advanced planes are super duper expensive, and that's a big place where a lot of that defense money goes.
I would not say that. Certainly, well, procurement is what you're talking about here, which is buying new vehicles or equipment and whatnot. And as far as the defense budget, procurement is a major item, but it's not anywhere near like a majority. If it's multiple items, really. I don't think there's one item that's like more than 50% of the defense budget, but probably the largest single item is just salaries and pensions, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, having expensive stuff, sure, that does run up costs, no doubt. But as with housing repairs, it's the labor that gets you. It's the cost of labor that really runs it up, especially given that the United States has a higher cost of living than equivalent nations, like Russia, France, etc. So that also inflates costs above and beyond what they would be otherwise.
That makes sense. Yeah, you have to pay your soldiers more for them to live if you're living in a more expensive place.
Yeah, that does give some advantage to some poorer countries that have a lower cost of living because it means their defense dollars, per se, go a little bit further in real terms. They can have a guy who's just as smart as an American equivalent, but they maybe only have to pay him half of what the American equivalent gets just because lower cost of living. Up to a point, right? They can't pay them too much less, right? Because then they have an incentive to leave, right? There is a global market for talent. So if you're a really skilled engineer or, just really any kind of skilled labor relevant to defense manufacturing, if the government is discounting your salary too much relative to the global standard, there's going to be a very strong incentive to go elsewhere. But in general, even given that fact, there is still some discount, right? Governments can only afford so much. And there is an appeal to being able to stay and work in your own country.
Mm-hmm.
The money as an incentive only goes so far. Like all of your family and friends are in your country. That's where your people are, your culture, your language, etc. There's always culture shock involved in moving overseas. So, you may make more money, but it's not always a comfortable transition. And not everybody wants to make it.
Mm-hmm.
Even those that try, it's not uncommon for those people even to end up coming back home for less money. But the point is that, yeah, there is a little bit of a bonus there for poorer countries. You get a little bit of an advantage there in that regard.
So I guess the original question, how much have we given to Ukraine since the war started? Not a lot relative to U.S. defense budget, but still a lot of just money compared to household bills, normal people money.
Oh, yeah. Like if you're compared to household spending, yeah, it's a lot of money for sure. Like $75 billion, like you don't, you're never going to spend that.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to spend that in like 100 lifetimes if you're just like the median household. So in that sense, a lot of money. But relative to the overall budget, it's pretty manageable.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a rounding error.
Yeah, and Chad was also pointing out that some of those values are going to be giving equipment that's old or not really used too much. So it's not as though you're giving your coolest stuff. You're giving the stuff that you weren't really using anyway. That was kind of your backup.
Yeah, there's that. But that's more relevant for like Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe just Europe generally, because they had not been updating their inventories. And they'd been planning to update them, for a long time. So this was kind of the big push that a lot of governments needed in order to justify spending the money to finally procure new equipment to replace the older stuff.
Mm-hmm.
For the US, though, yeah, we did have older stuff. We were planning on replacing it anyway. That's true. So in terms of cost, yeah, it's kind of a wash, you could say. The only dangerous thing there is that when you run the inventories too low before you have the replacements, there is some strategic risk there. In that sense, it would have been much, much better to have maintained some minimal level of productivity in the defense industrial base so that it had a much greater ability to scale up in the event of an emergency. We're kind of learning the hard way right now that was a bad idea. You can't entirely blame them because nobody expected that another major war would break out that would basically just be 21st century World War I style trench warfare.
Mm.
That was a very unexpected outcome. Nobody was predicting that. And so because nobody predicted it, there was a perception that a lot of productive capacity for things like artillery shells and whatnot was not really needed in modern warfare. People didn't really think that was going to be a thing. So the Ukraine war definitely caught people off guard in that regard. And that's a big reason why it's taken so long for both Europe and the United States to significantly scale up its production of artillery shells and related equipment and munitions. To be fair, Russia was in a pretty similar boat. I've noticed a lot that people in media seem to kind of just implicitly assume. I shouldn't say media. I've noticed a lot that analysts, even, generally not Russia specialists, but just like generic international relations specialists, they tend to implicitly assume that Russia's defense industrial base is still very, very strong. Even if it's weakened significantly since the Cold War ended, they still think that they can do basic stuff, like produce lots of artillery shells. And, that's a logical inference, given that artillery is like a really basic munition compared to a lot of the newer stuff that was getting made even at the end of the Cold War. But at the same time, whenever I try to kind of dig in and find more specific numbers, the Russia specialists, the guys that actually specialize in studying Russia and its military, they don't seem to share that opinion. So I can't conclusively say that the IR guys are wrong on that, but the specialists are saying that Russian manufacturing, specifically with regard to artillery and other defense equipment, is not that strong. They've been facing similar difficulties to those faced by Europe and the United States. That doesn't mean that they were not in a better position overall. They had been doing better in maintaining what limited capabilities they could afford, unlike the US, which basically just threw up its hands and said, well, we don't need to worry about artillery anymore, so we'll just kind of let that wither. But beyond that, the Russians do have a problem in their defense industrial base, and that has hobbled their ability to keep their troops supplied to the degree that they would like, up to and including artillery shells. I don't think if they had no problems with producing artillery, that they would have gone to North Korea and basically traded them for something like 1 million artillery shells from North Korea. There was a lot of open source intelligence that was tracking the shipments. They found a North Korean cargo ship that was most likely chock full of them. So those deliveries have been made, it seems. But yeah, that does suggest that there's an issue there. Both Ukraine and Russia have had to engage in the rationing of munitions on account of their lack of ability to produce enough to keep up with demand at the front.
Yeah, and we've talked about their military doctrine before, and it's pretty much shell the crap out of a location and then move in once stuff is rubble.
Yeah, that's the main approach at this point. It's sort of derived from older Soviet doctrine, which has been kind of updated over time here and there in different ways. Like everybody uses brigades now as the main unit, which was not the case when the Cold War ended. But other than that, like in terms of overall, doctrine, yeah, it is still a very artillery-centric form of warfare that both the Ukrainian army and the Russian army are propagating. So artillery is going to be a major determinant of the outcome. And in so much as Russia has an advantage in that regard, that does favor them in terms of forecasting. But at the same time, war's not over yet. And, as much as Russia might be ahead of Europe and North America in terms of artillery production at the moment, Russia has much less ability to scale that up quickly. Which is not to say they have no capability to do so, but the U.S. economy and the European economy are obviously much, much larger. So if they really wanted to, they could scale it up significantly more than Russia would ever hope to be able to match. The fact that it hasn't happened yet is more a reflection of a lack of political will in Washington than Brussels, than in a lack of economic capability. The money is there, the expertise is there, the equipment is there. There's just a lot of red tape and a lack of willingness to cut through it in order to meet the needs of the emergency.
Tasdingerman.
Yeah, so we'll see who wants to let up on the gas first in terms of the money race of backing one side or the other, because it's more of a war of attrition, like you're saying, World War I, rather than like a few decisive battles that determine who's actually winning it and kind of concluding the conflict.
Yeah, it's very grueling. I cannot understate how surprising, if not shocking, it is that this form of warfare has returned. That was not the prediction for how things like this would pan out. But we are where we are.
Yep.
And unfortunately, it's a test of wills at this point to see who can last longer. So is Russia going to hold on, or is the West going to quit? That's basically what it comes down to. Ukraine could fight on without the West, but the odds would be heavily stacked against them. They were already not great, but they've exceeded all expectations in their ability to hold on as well as they have. But without Western support, it's hard to see a path forward for them. So Western willpower is probably going to be the main determining variable here as far as the final outcome, whatever it may end up being. Which makes it all the more strange, if not frustrating, that so many people in the West are, they're kind of invested in it, but their attention span leaves something to be desired. Because there's always something else happening somewhere else. And people, naturally people are the most concerned with their own issues, their own lives, whatnot. Domestic political issues are paramount in any country's politics. So, you can't begrudge people for not following Ukraine still. What is it, like almost 2 years now? Well, not 2 years, but a year and a half roughly since the conflict started. There's other stuff going on, and the lack of movement on the front line has meant that the conflict is not really changing much, which means there's not as much to report on, which means that it's out of the headlines more and more, which is to the benefit of the Russians for the most part. So trying to find a way to continue to motivate people to care about the issue at all, is actually getting more challenging the longer the war goes on.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's easier for within Russia because they can basically control the propaganda for their own people. But for other countries that are backing Ukraine in the conflict, it's a harder sell for their citizens to be like, yes, continue to send money from our government to yours.
Yeah. Yeah, and it remains to be seen whether or not they'll be able to do that. That's one of the reasons that the Ukrainian government and Zelensky in particular, sometimes just tries to say things or do things just to get in the headlines. Begging for money, demanding more weapons, saying that Ukraine is, fighting for the West and whatnot. It all sounds very dramatic and earnest, right? But a lot of that is not really about that. Well, it's not just about getting more resources. It's also just about making sure that Ukraine does not fall out of the public attention, that it stays in the headlines sufficiently for people to remember, that it is a thing and that it does still need help and that it's worth helping. So don't begrudge him too much if he says something that pisses you off. A lot of that is just PR. Case in point was the, quote unquote, falling out between Ukraine and Poland that happened over the past year. The Polish government had a very, very close election a couple months ago. And the incumbent political party, the Law and Justice Party, started to kind of turn on Ukraine a little bit, because there were some outstanding issues with regard to grain in particular, and also trucks that were aggravating people. Ukraine's economy is disproportionately dependent on the export of grain. And of course, they can't export nearly as much through their ports as they used to on account of the Russian Navy. So they've been trying to export as much as they can through countries on their western border. But the impact of that was depressing the price of grain in those markets, which was aggravating farmers. And of course, that aggravated their representatives in their respective governments. And the result is that those governments started putting restrictions on the flow of Ukrainian grain into their market, which the Ukrainian government didn't particularly appreciate because it desperately needs any and all revenue that it can get from the sale of those grains. So there was a little bit of tension from that. The truck thing just has to do with Ukrainian trucks being given the right to come into the European market. That obviously depressed incomes, I should say, for truckers in Europe. So they weren't very happy about that. They even blockaded some of the border crossings not too long ago over that as part of a protest. So the Law and Justice Party was trying to take advantage of that a little bit, kind of try to put pressure a little bit on the opposition, because the opposition is very Europhile and pro-Ukrainian. So the Law and Justice Party tried to distinguish itself from them, partly by taking advantage of populist discontent over cost of living issues and the perception that the conflict in Ukraine is a major contributor to them. Certainly it's a significant contributor, but Whether or not it's the major contributor is a bit debatable. There were already cost of living issues before the war. Regardless, Law and Justice ended up losing the election. And afterwards, relations with Ukraine, pretty much returned to normal. It hasn't been as much of an issue. These economic issues were not as much of an issue afterwards. Still some unhappy people, especially the truckers, for sure. And I don't doubt that the Polish government is going to try to do more to try to mitigate the fallout of the war on individual people, especially in so much as that fallout comes in the form of aid provided by the West to Ukraine. But it's probably going to be managed much more quietly now that the election is over. And the Ukrainian government, for its part, it responded to a lot of this with a lot of angry statements. They came out accusing the Polish government of kind of betraying them and whatnot. But I don't think a lot of that was very genuine. I suspect that was just pushing back to take advantage of of the moment to try to get back in the news.
Mm-hmm.
It was always my expectation that once the election was over in Poland, then people wouldn't care, or at least the government wouldn't care so much. And that's more or less been borne out since the election ended. But yeah, that's just an example of how the Ukrainian government just tries to stay in the news, even if it means bad-mouthing a nominal ally. They're not above doing that if it means that they can get the issue, the war, and get people paying attention in the West to the war.
Also, as we're talking about different countries and stuff, I see there's some first-time chatters here. If you have a first-hand perspective of the country that we're talking about, feel free to weigh in. And if we get stuff wrong, absolutely share with us. We don't have complete information about everything, so thank you for your feedback as we talk through this stuff. There's someone who weighed in and said, not true both sides, as there at this point there are over 5 parties in the Polish government, and they're quite unanimous when it comes to Ukrainian grain being highly problematic for Polish economics. Why is the grain problematic? Is it because it's related to the war?
Problematic for Poland?
Yeah.
Just because farmers in Poland have to compete with it.
Oh, I see.
Increased supply of grain drives down prices, and lower prices means lower incomes for Polish farmers.
Mm-hmm.
So they're unhappy about that. They write not their congressman, but they write their representative in government and ask them to do something about it. And of course, rural representatives in any political system invariably go to bat for them.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like here in the U.S., where you have the districts that are largely rural. We have a lot of rural districts in the U.S. because we have the first past the post system. So as a result, there's disproportionate, you might say, representation of rural economic interests in the U.S. government. It doesn't work quite like that in a lot of European countries like Poland, but even so, agricultural interests do tend to have a very loud voice, just because, spatially speaking, they encompass most of the country's territory.
Mm-hmm.
So when they complain, they listen, and it turned into an issue accordingly.
Gotcha. I was saying that the Ukrainian grain was a lot cheaper than Polish grain. So I could see why there would be extra pressure on their market. Yeah, you told me, I think, the last world discussion that there were, because of some of the shipping costs, it's cheaper to ship stuff, like import it from another country, than it is to ship it from one place to another within the U.S. So
yeah, Jones Act.
Yeah, Jones Act.
Yeah, it's a little goofy.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that is the case.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think Europe has that problem. They're generally pretty good about the single market. They're pretty good about managing the single market in the European Union. So to my knowledge, they do not have an equivalent to the Jones Act in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ukraine has been trying to export grain through the ports of neighboring countries. I think there's one in particular in Romania that they've been trying to push grain to, but The trouble there is that the port in Romania was not built to export large amounts of grain. If you really want to optimize an export terminal for grain, you need to build the relevant facilities, granaries, storage, that kind of thing. Also, specialized loading equipment. And, they have some of that in Romania, but it's not nearly enough to manage everything that Ukraine has to export. So it's a pretty significant bottleneck. It's better than nothing, but Ukraine has to find other options if they want to export everything they're producing, which is, part of the reason they push it into places like Poland and Central Europe. They have been getting more out by sea. There's a lot of weird shit going on in the Black Sea. Like, I can't even keep track of it. I had thought that the Russians had almost a total blockade of Ukraine, but there actually have been grain ships that have managed to go to Odessa, Ukraine's main port city on the Black Sea, load with grain and then leave, and then successfully exit the Black Sea. So, that they had been doing that when there was the grain deal in place. Russia and Ukraine had actually made an agreement that involved free passage, the allowance of passage of grain ships from Ukraine to the world market. But that deal collapsed, I want to say late last year or so. Is that when it was? God, I have trouble remembering the dates. But that deal did collapse. And so I had assumed that there would be a resumption of the blockade, but instead the Russians have kind of been wishy-washy as far as, just what ships are allowed to come and go and all this kind of thing. So they apparently are allowing some ships to make it through.
Could it just be corruption of like they're supposed to not allow ships, but if a ship is like, hey, you guys want a bunch of free bread? And they're like, you know what? You can go buy it. Yeah.
No, I don't think it's corruption per se, at least not at a sort of individual unit level. Like, I don't think the Russian Navy is being corrupted, because Moscow would notice if that was the case. Like, the grain ships are very large. It's hard to miss them. So leadership would find out about it and they would do something about it if that was the case. I think more likely the issue is that some of the countries that Russia is dependent on to circumvent sanctions are leaning on them to allow their ships to make it to Ukraine. So some of these ships are owned by Turkish companies, for example, and Turkey is a very important waypoint for Russian intelligence agents, smugglers, basically anybody who wants to smuggle sanctioned Western stuff into Russia. A lot of them buy Western sanctioned stuff from Turkey, import it to Turkey, and then export it on to Russia, because Turkey is not really participating in the sanctions regime against Russia. So there's a pretty brisk re-export trade centered in Turkey. And because Russia really needs a lot of that stuff, especially some of the more strategic materials, like, say, factory equipment with which to increase production of weapons and ammunition, that gives the Turkish government a good deal of leverage. And, I can't prove it, but my suspicion is that the Turkish government, as well as other similar governments that have similar leverage over Russia, are using that to get Russia to agree to allow these ships to go to Ukraine, load up with grain, and then export it abroad. Might be worth mentioning, too, that Turkey is not one of the top importers of Ukrainian grain, but they do import a pretty decent chunk from it. And even if, regardless, importing it will kind of staunch inflation just because it serves to lower food prices. And given how much inflation Turkey has had over the past couple of years, that's pretty desirable, Regardless of the Turkish government's position on Ukraine, it definitely helps the government look better if they can import a lot more grain that will deflate prices somewhat. Does that make sense? Am I sounding crazy?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I haven't really thought too much about grain exports and how they would be affected by war, but it's definitely a big part of their market, and apparently Ukrainian grain is very good, and there's a lot of it.
Well, the soil in Ukraine is very fertile. They have what's called chemizim, something like that. Basically, black soil, black earth, is what I've heard to it. What is what I've heard it referred to colloquially here in the United States. I think Canada has a bunch of black earth as well, or at least a big swath of their territory is black earth, which is very fertile. So Ukrainian grain, correspondingly, is very. They're able to grow it very efficiently, and they have a comparative advantage in that on the global market. I think it's illegal even to take black earth out of Ukraine. Like you can't box it up and send it abroad so that somebody could use it in a garden or something. It's just that valuable to the Ukrainian economy that the government restricts that.
Interesting.
Yeah, a lot of Middle Eastern countries and North African countries actually buy a lot of Ukrainian grain, or at least they used to before the war disrupted the trade. I think Egypt in particular was disproportionately dependent on Ukraine for something like half of its grain imports, rather. So the onset of the war was very disruptive for them. It actually caused inflation to spike because a lot of the countries in the region, especially countries like Egypt, are still developing countries. And in developing countries, the basket of consumption, you might say, that the stuff that people spend their money on is disproportionately comprised of food, just because incomes are lower and food is relatively more expensive. And so when food jumps up in price, that really squeezes budgets in wallets within the developing world, but especially so in the Middle East, given the dependence on Ukrainian grain. So they felt that very distinctly. They felt that disruption, and a lot of governments in the region really heaped pressure on Russia to allow more grain, to which the Russian government responded by saying, it's fine, you can buy more grain from us, which was not a very reassuring response, because even if Russia exports more to them, that's still going to leave global prices elevated, just because Ukrainian grain had been knocked out of the market. So, the only way to ensure that prices return to something resembling the antebellum status quo was to get Ukrainian grain back on the market. And that's what they continued to ask for, to very little effect until the grain deal was signed between Russia and Ukraine in 2022. And then apparently recently, again, when they were able to get Russia to, I don't know what part of what was involved in the deal, but Russia does seem to have implicitly agreed to allow the export of some Ukrainian grain by sea. There had to have been some quid pro quo there, but most likely it was between Russia and some set of Middle Eastern countries that really wanted that grain. Yeah, it was not lost on anybody in the region that the Russian government wanted to use grain as leverage over countries in the region. They did not appreciate that. That doesn't mean that they're automatically going to side with Ukraine because of it, but everybody was aware what Moscow was trying to do there as far as leverage. And it did not really end up working. I think they got some favorable outcomes at some UN votes, some abstaining by certain Middle Eastern countries on votes related to Ukraine, but that was about it. I think that's probably as much as they could hope for. But in order to do that, they had to burn some diplomatic capital, because again, governments in the region did not appreciate being pushed into a corner as far as their grain imports. So they've been doing what they can to try to reverse that. And it seems like Turkey, at least, if not also the UAE and the Saudis, have been able to get what they wanted there.
I didn't know any of this about grain.
Yeah, it's an important commodity.
Yeah.
Lots of people around the world really cannot afford to eat a lot of meat. just because it's relatively expensive. And so they kind of default to things like grain, corn, fruits, vegetables, etc., stuff like that. And again, a disproportionate share of their income is spent on food because they don't make enough. So managing, the price of those items is very, very important. Not only for just economic stability, but also just for the health and well-being of people, because it does not take a big price hike in those kinds of goods to push people into borderline starvation. I think the technical term would be food insecure. And there certainly has been a jump in food insecurity in much of the developing world since 2022. Yeah, the United States is a major exporter too, with the trouble that the United States had last year. Not as sure about this year, I haven't read as much about it, but last year in 2022, there was a series of basically bad weather, a combination of weak rains, droughts, what have you, as well as heat waves that damaged a lot of the crop and inhibited the ability of the agricultural sector to produce as much wheat as they would have liked. And because that was the case, the United States government kind of knew from pretty early on that it would not be able to make up the shortfall in the global grain market, the global wheat market, maybe I should say, that the decline in Ukrainian production caused. So there was kind of a window, an opportunity there for the United States to help out there, significantly increase exports, eat up market share, and try to alleviate some of that pressure on developing countries. But the sector just wasn't ready for it. They just weren't in any shape for it. That might have changed this year, but not so much last year, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Sub-Saharan Africa. Sorry, go ahead.
We have a lot of land mass to
Yeah.
grow stuff. Not all the soil is good. One of the fun things you learned living in Texas is that the soil is very clay-like, which sucks for growing crops, which is why it's very ranch heavy.
We actually used to have a lot of fertile land here.
What happened?
Just bad farming practices eroded the topsoil.
Oh.
So now there's nothing left. Yeah, I remember in high school I read in a history book that the first settlers that came to Texas found topsoil that was something like 1.5 yards deep.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe even a couple yards deep. I don't remember exactly, but there was a lot of it. But subsequent soil erosion basically dispersed it almost entirely over successive generations of just piss-poor farming practices.
Damn, today I learned.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of that going on in the 1800s in the U.S. It eventually culminated in the Dust Bowl. I'm sure you remember that, right?
Dust Bowl was like weather event thing where there was a bunch of tornadoes and shit?
No, it was specifically like Great Plains.
Mm-hmm.
I think a specific region of the Great Plains, kind of the Panhandle region in particular, but it was sort of a broader phenomena as well. Just hit the Panhandle region like particularly bad. But basically what happened is that something like 100 years or so of inefficient, bad farming practices had eroded the topsoil and left it very loose, to the point where by the early 20th century, wind was literally just blowing it away en masse, to the point where it was creating these big dust storms. And it hit a critical level in the 1930s. As a result of it, combined with drought, there were just these massive dust storms that were basically obliterating the fertility of much of the land there. And a huge chunk of the region ended up having to just migrate out and move to places like California and whatnot. Have you ever heard of the Grapes of Wrath?
Yeah, that's a book by whatever that really macho aggressive author guy is. What's his name?
Oh, don't get me lying. But that story is about the Dust Bowl.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the farmers in the book. That's where they were coming from.
John Steinbeck.
There you go. Yeah, there was a lot of. I think the one famous story I remember about the Dust Bowl was there was a congressman arguing that Washington needed to do more to help farmers manage their land better in order to ensure that there was not a collapse of agriculture in the Great Plains region. And there was a lot of resistance. You know how it is with Washington. There's always people that don't want the government to do stuff. And so he was having to try to overcome that. And it just so happened during his speech, I don't know if he purposely timed it like this or not, but during one of his speeches on the issue, one of the dust storms from the Great Plains actually reached Washington. It had actually blotted out the sun.
Wow.
Yeah, over the Capitol. And he actually mentioned it during the speech that, the lighting, that it got darker specifically because of this issue and that it was just that serious and that government action was necessary. He eventually won his vote. It was effective. Yeah, there was, I'm not an expert on, farming practices, agriculture, whatnot, but I think one of the problems, if I'm remembering this correctly, was that a lot of farmers did not rotate crops very often back in the day. If you just continuously farm the same patch of land over and over again, year after year, you wear it out and you lose topsoil, and what soil you have becomes less fertile because the nutrition in it basically just is sucked out. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to farm the same patch of land for maybe 2-3 years straight, something like that. And then you're supposed to leave it fallow. In other words, just don't farm anything there to give it some time to recover. And I think there's also supposed to be a year where you plant specific types of crops that are known for their ability to replenish the soil. I think maybe soy is one of them. Is that right? Something like that. There's certain types of plants and even cash crops that, once you harvest them, like the remainder, what's left behind can be, even just growing the crop in general replenishes the soil, but also you can bury what's left and plant something new the next year, and the soil will be better for it. Yeah, way out of my depth here, but for what it's worth, that's part of the reason that the Dust Bowl phenomena happened and why it ended up being so disruptive to the economy in the region. How did I get onto the Dust Bowl?
I said that Texas soil was bad, and you said, well, it wasn't always that way.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Dust Bowl was very much the outcome, a result of the same kinds of bad farming practices that you see in Texas. Northern Texas was the most afflicted, actually. The Dust Bowl encompassed that northern Texas region, like around Amarillo. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep, I've been up there.
Yeah.
Whole lot of nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, that area was part of the Dust Bowl, and it was really bad for a lot of people. I think there was a story. I was watching a PBS documentary way back in the day. I used to watch them all the time in college. And one of them was about the Dust Bowl. And I think there was a story about a kid who actually got stuck out in a dust storm when it hit. And he made his way home, but he ended up going blind because so much sand ended up getting into his eyes.
Wow, damn.
Yeah, the dust storms, were no joke. They were quite large. Yeah, lots of people lost their livelihoods over that. But you got a legendary American classic book out of it, so there's something.
Yeah,
and a good movie.
A lot of great art is born out of tragedy.
Yeah.
Will Blur in chat said the natives in Mexico would plant gourds, corn, and beans together, and then they would never have to rest the soil because they complemented each other with how they affected it.
That's cool. Pretty cool.
Yeah. It's interesting because farming is usually one of those things that, as a suburban and city kid, you're kind of seen as like, oh, farmers aren't educated as much as city folk are, but what they do matters, and if they do it wrong, it messes stuff up big time. So there is a lot of intelligence and knowledge and experience that goes into good farming. not just for the short term, but the long term, and taking good care of the land and getting the best value out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It also fits with the general notion that stuff doesn't seem as complex until you step into it. Today, as one of the subathon events, I played chess for 4 hours. Oh my gosh. Chess is so hard and I'm so bad. I didn't win a single game in 4.5 hours, and these are like 10-minute games. So it was a very humbling experience. And I would guess that that's kind of a general life experience, right? Is you've heard about a certain profession or game or whatever, and you're like, yeah, like Rocket League, car soccer, like I could do that. But the people who are actually good, they're going to know a lot of the skill that goes into it that you couldn't even imagine when you're first getting started. So there were a lot of times that I shouted, oh fuck, like one of my pieces that was very valuable and I didn't want to lose. I put it into a bad situation and there's no way to defend it. So similarly, farming, more complex than you think.
Yeah, my grandparents grew up on separate farms in the Midwest back in the 1940s.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always heard lots of stories from them, about how challenging it is, and how it is kind of a skilled job.
Mm-hmm.
It does take practice and experience to really make it work.
Mm-hmm.
So they never really appreciated it when they heard politicians kind of poo-poo it.
Yeah.
Politicians like to focus on the manufacturing sector. That's their big thing. They want to get more jobs for the city folk. That's how you get economic development. But sometimes when they talk about it, they kind of mention agriculture as like a lesser skill, like a lesser field.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably don't even think about it. But when they talk about it like that, that actually does aggravate a lot of people in rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Rightfully so.
Yeah, I knew a guy in grad school who actually grew up on a farm. And he determined from a very, very young age that it was his life's mission to get the fuck off the farm. He did not want to stay a minute longer than he needed to, because it was just constant work. Like, it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Like every day. There are no days off on a farm, right? You're always working. Like for him in particular, the story he told was about having to constantly fix fencing. That was his chore.
Mm-hmm.
Farms tend to be pretty large, right? Pretty decent sized estates. And so to ensure that, your animals don't, wander off, or more importantly, don't wander off into somebody else's property and destroy crops or something, you have to have fencing. But you have to maintain it. Right, stuff happens. Animals get to it. The weather gets to it. So you've got to constantly keep an eye on all of your fencing. And given how much fencing you have, that takes time. And when there's a problem, which there frequently is, you got to fix it. So this guy spent a good chunk of his childhood just doing that, and he got so sick of it that he just vowed that he would never do it again. He's never going back to a farm.
You can't make me farm anymore. Yeah, lots of tedious small things that when you work in a company or a larger business, a lot of the labor is distributed over many, many parts, and the physical labor is oftentimes close to zero. You don't have to lift anything, you don't have to push anything, you don't have to walk very far. You get to like go in the door, sit at a desk, basically. Mentally, you might have a lot of work to do, but physically speaking, yeah, farming, one of the most intensive jobs for sure. And the margins on farming profits would be pretty low. It's not as though you're going to like strike it rich and get a super good strawberry and then you're a millionaire.
Yeah, unfortunately the case. You might be able to do well if you get some kind of exclusive agreement to supply some kind of manufacturer or maybe restaurants in your area. That's increasingly common.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching a YouTube video about, are you familiar with sriracha sauce?
Yes.
Yeah. So the main manufacturer of sriracha sauce in the United States actually had an exclusive agreement with a farm in, I think, California. to produce the key ingredient. It's like jalapenos. I don't remember whatever the key spice is in sriracha sauce. It has to be grown, and so they had an exclusive agreement with a big farm in California to produce all of that, whatever it was. And they had a big falling out, basically. Later on, it was an interesting sort of business news type video. Business news doesn't really get the credit it deserves. It actually can be very interesting, but more to the point, yeah, if you can get an agreement as a farm owner to get a big contract like that, you can do pretty well for yourself. But the trouble is that there's only so many contracts like that, and there's only so many farms that really have the scale to provide enough produce to meet that kind of demand. Yeah, I was up in I sound like a redneck probably. I was up at rural Illinois. I guess it was like a town, a town in Illinois for a family member's funeral a couple of years ago. And while I was there, I was talking to some of these relatives, a lot of them who I'd like never met. And they were from the area, and I was asking them, like, what's the market like here? Like, how's the economy? Because I'm a nerd, so of course I did. And they were telling me that probably there's not going to be any small farmers in the area left within the next like 20 to 50 years.
Why? Because it's too hard to compete.
Yeah, because the main producers now are corporate farmers. Like, there are actually corporations that will buy up large tracts of land, and they'll produce just shit tons of produce. If not for individual companies and manufacturers, then just for general usage for like grocery stores and whatnot. So they've eaten up a lot of market share. And the result is that small-time farmers kind of have to make do with what little is left of the market, which generally just means providing things like fruit and veg for like a local farmer's market, or maybe getting a contract to supply a couple of restaurants, just small time stuff like that. But it's not really lucrative. You're not going to get rich doing it, and it's not even really something you can get much of a livelihood out of these days. One of the things that surprised me during that trip is that I was told that there's actually a lot of people that had jobs in the city that kept a plot of land in the rural areas around the city that they would actually till during certain times of year. So they were not full-time farmers. Again, they just had urban type jobs, but sometime once a year maybe they would go out and plant some crops and then sell them at harvest for a little bit of side income, basically. So I had no idea that happened. I just assumed everybody farming was like full-time farmer. Yeah. I didn't know you could do it as a side gig, but apparently that is a viable option. But it's a lot of hard work, and a lot of the younger folks are not that interested in it. They prefer to just find better paying jobs elsewhere. And so there's not a lot of young folks who are staying behind who are going to keep it up. And so, the way they were telling me, the way they were talking about it, what they were saying was that there wouldn't be any left pretty soon, before too long.
Any left? That's no small farmers left.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there's. I'm sure there will be elsewhere. I mean, it's a big country, so there's invariably going to be some somewhere. But in that particular area, it's not looking good overall. Yeah, it doesn't help that a lot of the inputs you need in order to have a profitable, productive farm are actually intellectual property now, which makes it more expensive. It used to be not people, but companies would mass produce things like fertilizer. What am I thinking of? The stuff you use to kill pesticide. There you go. Fertilizer, pesticide, seeds. All of that stuff was pretty readily available. But especially with regard to seeds, now it's more expensive because it's all genetically modified stuff. And all of that is patented. So the price you pay per pound of seed is like much higher than for like normal seed. It kind of pays for itself because it's a lot more productive, right? You get a lot more for what you put in when it comes to GMO, the genetically modified stuff. But even so, the fact that you have to borrow more money at the start right before planting means that there's a higher risk if something goes wrong. And, the weather is unpredictable, shit happens, you never know. And so the result is that there's relatively more farmers now that are getting squeezed financially because they can't keep up. And if you think it's bad here, it's actually even worse in places like India. Farmer suicides are a problem here in the United States too, but in India, it's like a big problem. That's super common over there.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of, the farmers there are way, way poorer than their equivalents in the West. And so they cut things like very close in terms of profits. Their profit margins are razor thin. And the government's corrupt, and there's a lot of corrupt middlemen that dominate the market and take like way more than their fair share. So they're getting squeezed regardless. But dependence on what is generally foreign imported stuff, like seeds, fertilizer, whatnot. Not always, but not frequently it is. Means that they have to borrow money and are basically constantly in debt to try to pay for all the inputs they need.
Mm-hmm.
And because the government supports are kind of weaker in India, on paper they're actually stronger. The government is very sort of socialist and interventionist, but it's also super corrupt and it's too poor to have a large administrative state. So in practice, they actually have weaker supports overall compared to the United States, certainly more so than Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that means is that they're much more vulnerable when there are problems with, say, the monsoon. I don't know if you're familiar with agriculture in India, but most of the rains, most of the water used for agriculture in India actually comes from the monsoon. So, rivers provide a decent amount, especially in like the Gangetic Plain, but even there, it's the monsoon season that really brings the rain that the farmers need. And if the rain doesn't come, if it's a weak monsoon season, then they're just screwed. Like there's nothing they can do. There's virtually no way for them to try to make the money they need to pay off the debts that they took. And the result is frequently generational debt. They'll pass that down. And it's especially bad if you have to borrow from the black market, because then you're dealing with basically the mob.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't like it when you don't pay them back.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, that can end very poorly for you. So, a lot of guys just end up perpetually in debt, and if they're at risk of losing their farm, a lot of them will just commit suicide.
Damn.
And that's unfortunately become so common that it is like a political issue in India. That is something that is discussed at like a national level even.
Yeah, chat's saying that Monsanto sues small farmers into the ground. I would guess any way that you can cut down at the competition, you would do so. And an entity with larger capital has more capacity to kind of bully the competition and try to take territory.
Yeah, that's why larger companies prefer more regulations and not less. They can afford regulations. The smaller competitors cannot.
Mm-hmm.
So very frequently, the larger companies that have dominant market share will actually go to public hearings about proposed new regulations. And they'll actually support them, generally with caveats. They don't want too much regulation either. But they also won't push back significantly on the stuff that's more inconvenient for smaller producers than for them.
Mm-hmm.
And if that regulation goes forward in that mold, the result is a competitive advantage for the market leader, which serves to centralize the market and make it less competitive, which is worse for consumers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, just from a recently vegan perspective, smaller farmers generally tend to be less bad ethically for how animals are treated, just because the larger the scale, the more they want to cut corner per just end product.
Mm-hmm.
So larger facilities with more animals crammed into smaller spaces per animal when you have these larger scale farms. So just as all the information is coming in as we talk about grains and farming and stuff, it seems like small farms are good in many ways. Of you get an actual product that you're more likely to trust with more sound ethical practice, but it's way harder work per person to make that stuff, and it's also hard to compete. with the huge entities that can basically just throw the powers of industrialization back at farming, which that wasn't the case for a lot of it. But now we have like gigantic tractors and like different ways to fertilize the ground and irrigation methods and all that kind of stuff. It's a very brave new world with robots doing a lot of the farming.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff out there. Did you mention, what do they call it? Vertical farming?
I've seen that. I've heard that it's not really that efficient yet, but I've seen that as a concept.
It's still nascent. They're still working on it.
Mm-hmm.
But they're getting there. It's got potential. Nothing else that'll give it could be a good productive use for some of the empty space in urban areas, spaces that are otherwise not being used for anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then look for the compromise solution, which is diagonal farming, when you want to mix in a little bit of horizontal with your vertical. I've done yard work. Like, that was one of the chores that was relegated to the kids in the family. So I've dug holes, I've planted stuff, I've done mowing, weed eating, edging, all that kind of stuff. So I get working with your hands and working outside and that kind of stuff. And there's a sort of sense of camaraderie and appeal in that. But the flip side is it is hard work. So you're not usually the happiest to have to do it. What chores did you have to do growing up?
Vacuum, do the dishes, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
We lived in apartments, so we didn't have a lawn.
Oh, gotcha, yeah. That is one of the benefits of having an apartment.
Yeah, technically. House is a little better. You don't have to deal with neighbors quite so much. But yeah. And it was a single mother household too, so I didn't get a lot of like manly type chores.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't really have anybody to teach me, so I'm not good with cars or whatnot, because that wasn't really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't really know any more than I did on a lot of that stuff. So yeah, just basic housekeeping, basically. Nothing too dramatic.
I do a really good vacuuming impression. A lot of people, they were asking me, Neuro, like, how did you get out of doing chores as a kid? And the answer is, if you have a 2-story house and your mom's like, boys, you need to vacuum the upstairs, you can actually continue to play Xbox Live if you can pull off one of these. Just do that a couple times, and she's like, I have such good kids. And you got another couple rounds in, so try that one at home.
Well played, sir. Very convincing.
Thank you. Years of practice.
Yeah.
We had I would say it's like a brotherly bonding moment where it felt like the beginning of an alliance rather than like contested territory, because you're kids, you're rivals, you're doing a lot of the same stuff. You're trying to beat each other at the video game. You're fighting over whatever game that you want to play. And I was raid leading in WoW, and I had 19 other people, and I was kind of telling them what to do, and my brother was watching. And my mom told me to go empty the dishwasher because it was my turn to. And my brother said, I'll get it. And that was like, wow. He saw what I was going through, and he said, you know what? This is a really important thing that you're doing right now, and I'm going to let you keep doing that by taking your shift. I'll never forget that. And we've been allies ever since then. But before then, it was like, you got to do chores now. I get to play WoW. So.
Oh, it's a cool moment.
Yeah.
Always nice to build some alliances.
Yep. Yeah, siblings, they have the things that they bicker about and stuff. But as they get older, they realize that they have a lot more in common with each other than the parents' generation. So there's a lot of stuff that you can actually go to bat for together and back each other up on. And parents, they don't hate to see it because they do like that collaboration and cooperation. So they can't really be mad if one sibling backs up the other. It kind of makes them proud in a way.
Yeah, whoa, whoa, yeah, whoa, geek, whoa, whoa.
How much older than you was he?
I'm 2 years older.
Oh, you're 2 years older than him. Okay.
Yeah.
So roughly the same age.
Yeah, definitely same generation and everything. So
Gotcha. Okay. I can't relate, so I'll take your word for it.
do you have siblings?
Are we counting the ones I've never met?
Let's go with yes.
I think I have 3, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
Total. That I know of. There possibly could be more. But I have 3 that I know of.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I've met is my sister.
Mm-hmm.
But she's definitely not in the same generation as me. She's about, I want to say 14 years younger than me. Yeah, so kind of a different relationship there than the one you're talking about, I suspect.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And your other siblings you have not met, but you know that they're your full sibling or half sibling?
Half siblings.
Gotcha. Yeah, the bonds that we make in life are really interesting between chosen relationships and then the ones that are dealt to you. I had a relatively lucky and safe upbringing where I didn't really have too much in terms of the chaotic challenges that children can face growing up. So I'm very grateful for that. But when I was growing up, I didn't really know that that could even happen. So I didn't have gratitude at the time. But that's one of the reasons I actually questioned my religion, was just how different situations are dealt to different people in a way that doesn't really reward or punish them appropriate to what they've done or how good of a life they're living. Because you're like a 3-year-old kid, something really bad happens to you. Like, were you actually misbehaving that badly to deserve that? Usually no. You're not really old enough to make big decisions and receive consequences for them just because you're so young and you don't really know how the world works yet. It's really interesting to me how the human brain is evolved, if you're taking the dry scientific approach, to basically exist as a hunter-gatherer, and then anything else that happens is kind of a surprise as you're born into the world. So genetically speaking, humans now are not that different from humans 300,000 years ago. So for a person to be born and then try to grapple with technology and stuff is pretty weird on the larger time scale of things and stuff. So I can respect the difficulties of parenting, and I cannot imagine the decisions that have to be made with the like social media era that people are growing up in now. It's super weird. The tribe size is very much not what it used to be. We have very large tribes now. It's one planet tribe.
Yeah, it's pretty wild what modern technology allows you to do. Didn't used to be you could have these giant metropolitan areas that are sustained by resources extracted from all over the planet, but now you can.
Yeah, now Dubai.
Now Dubai. Well, not just Dubai. Look at the United States, right? I think about half. Actually, it's more than half. I think it's like 60% of the entire population of the United States is in the top 20 largest metro areas. So that's a lot of people concentrated into a very small set of spaces.
True.
It used to be much more evenly distributed across U.S. territory. Right? It used to be kind of more heavily concentrated across the Midwest into a variety of mid-sized industrial cities, and in the Northeast as well. where you had some of the similar mid-tier industrial cities and a couple major industrial cities. And then everything else was pretty kind of rural and sparsely populated. But since that time, the demographic distribution, you could say, spatially speaking, has changed dramatically. Like, it's so concentrated now, like to a much greater degree than would have been possible, even 50 years ago. The amount of food, supplies, electronics, vehicles, all, the amount of stuff that you need to keep a population of 6 million some people, whatever the median size of a metro area in the United States might be, like, it's a lot. Historically speaking, you would have needed most of the stuff for a city to be relatively close by, because logistically it would have been too difficult to move enough stuff to support a larger population than a mid-tier, roughly sized city.
Yeah.
But now we've got so much technology, supply chains can be so much more complex now, can be so much longer, and we have so much more digital technology with which to manage them that it's possible to do like fully global supply chains. And so that's removed the cap on the size of urban areas to a degree that is virtually that would have been science fiction like 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, I was looking at this a couple of years ago. I was being a nerd and looking at the populations of different cities across time. And I noticed that, I think it was back in the 1950s, Chicago was the second largest city in the United States. It was a large metro area, and that was, sort of a symbol for what a large city in the United States should look like. If not a large city anywhere in the world. The U.S. had much higher ranking cities in the global population statistics than it does now back in the 1950s. But regardless, the population was about, that is to say, of the city of Chicago in the 1950s, was about 6 million people, if I'm remembering it correctly. And that's about how big the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex is now. Yeah. And we're only fourth, I think, in terms of the size of metro areas in the United States. So, we're not even like top two, like Chicago was back in the day. And there's a lot of cities that are pretty close to Dallas, or at least to the DFW metroplex. In the top 10, they're all pretty close together in general. So it's a wild time to be alive.
Absolutely.
For a variety of reasons, but this is one of the less traumatizing ones.
Ooh, that reminds me of the question that I get asked all the time. That's probably a pretty normal table conversation thing. If you could be born into a different time period, what would that be?
A different time period. Wow. Yeah, that's a really complicated question, right?
Yeah.
Because you're kind of implicitly assuming that you would be the same kind of person. The implicit question is, what kind of time period would you want to live in? But asking what time period would you prefer to be born in, you would be a different person, right? Like, if you were born in a different era, the whole trajectory of your life would be so different. It would be impossible to say whether or not you would actually grow up to enjoy the era you chose.
All right, let's say you're born with the same body, the same stats as you currently are. The same gifts and talents and demeanor.
To be born in, all right. I'd have to go modern.
All right, that's
like
fair.
even right now, actually. Maybe even today. Maybe the world ends, I don't know, but I will probably be okay. So, and given how technology is going, being born today would probably be pretty cool overall. Given how much cool shit is on the horizon. And I would probably end up with a different family situation, which would be nice. I don't want to knock again. I don't want to, knock single mothers, but single mother households can be a pretty rough way to grow up,
Yeah.
even in the best of circumstances. And mine were pretty good. I did not have a bad childhood, but yeah, two-parent household superior model, I gotta say, given my own experience. So yeah, I'd say today. I want to see what's coming. I would say that, given the chance.
Nice. That's fair. I said the future.
Oh,
Whenever people ask that question, I think of a few things that I kind of like have had romanticized to me in various ways, like Vikings, super cool in media and stuff, like going out in a ship, discovering new land, all that cool stuff. But then I think of like all the blood that would be on my hands and the ethical ramifications, and it's like, that's a pretty bad choice.
Yeah.
If I want to at least maintain my same good evil alignment. So
There you go.
yeah, a lot of past eras would be interesting, but a lot of times we romanticize them in a way that makes them sound better to us or sound cooler than us than they actually were at the time. Say, for example, pirates. Look what the Pirates of the Caribbean movies did to us. They make us think that pirates are sexy, when pirates really are horrible and would just pillage and plunder any old innocent merchant person or traveler. So not really a good force in the world, pirates. But based on the movies, Johnny Depp, Keira Knightley, Orlando Bloom, pirates are hot. That's how we see them now. So similarly for past stuff like samurai, for example, also very heavily romanticized. Sounds cool. Would you actually want to be there? Probably not. Would you enjoy some of it scenically for a little bit? Probably yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't mind going back for a visit, but I wouldn't want to live in most of the past just because of the lack of, just the lack of healthcare facilities, really. Yeah, I don't want to scratch, I don't want to scratch my toe and then just die of an infection. I'd prefer the higher, better odds I would get in the modern era.
True. And there are a lot of people who are alive now. Maybe some people in the chat can share if it applies to you, but many of us would not be alive today if it were not for modern medicine in some capacity. I know I had an asthma attack when I was young, so I think if I were exposed to the same stuff, I would have died to that, I think.
Oh, really?
Or at least taken a lot of damage, yeah. Yeah, so thanks, modern medicine, for helping us out with stuff and helping some of us exist when we otherwise would not have.
Oh, thank you very much. We get to keep Neuro. That's a pretty good trade-off.
Chat, what time period would you be born into if you can choose?
Can I point something out? We would be answering this question way, way differently if we were women.
Maybe?
No, maybe. Childbirth has historically been way, way dangerous.
Yeah, but we both picked modern or future, though.
Yeah.
So,
but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If we were women, there would be no like, well, maybe there's no maybes.
Yeah.
Like, for sure.
Yeah, women's rights historically in the past have not been the best or even existing.
Yeah. There's a good chunk of history where women were basically commodities. I don't know that I would relish returning to that.
Yeah. That was one of the things that the Vikings TV show pointed out, is like, it was so revolutionary that the Vikings allowed women to take wives and have property, because the English did not at the time. They were like, what?
Oh, wow. I'd never heard of that.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why Lagertha was a famous shield maiden or whatever of whatever Norway or Denmark area that she was in, was that she took wives and had a fiefdom, basically. People fought for her and that kind of stuff.
Huh. Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, there are some famous shieldy ladies that have existed through time. But there are other cultures that would have like different it's hard to say breakthrough because certain cultures, like to them, it was just intuitive that you would let women do this stuff. But for others, it was definitely different or weird. I think India, in certain ways, is more inclusive of women in some categories, but then not in others.
Yeah, it really depends where you live, I think. Like the government is officially secular and encourages, what would you call it? What's the technical name for it? Family planning. That's what it is. So the government encourages family planning. In other words, if you want to get birth control, restrict the size of your family, etc., that's fine. Like the government is totally okay with that. In fact, probably no government on earth is more okay with that than India. Population growth surpassed economic growth in India for much of the 20th century, to the point where it was considered a major barrier for India's economic development. And the government was quite desperate to try to find ways to curtail that growth some way, somehow. But for much of the post-independence period, they just lacked the administrative capacity to really substantively do much about it. So family planning was embraced quite early in India relative to other post-colonial independent states in the developing world, specifically for that reason. It got so bad that the government actually seriously considered involuntary sterilization, like mass involuntary sterilization, as a potential solution. And that was one of the reasons Indira Gandhi got to be really, really unpopular, especially in rural areas.
Who's Indira Gandhi as opposed to the
Mahatma Gandhi?
Yeah.
No relation between them. Gandhi is a pretty common name in Western India.
Gotcha.
So, two separate people. In fact, Gandhi wasn't even her original name. Gandhi was her husband's name. I don't even remember his. I don't think anybody remembers her husband's name. He was never involved in politics. At least I don't think he was involved in politics. He was kind of just like some dude. And somebody can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But yeah, she was actually. Have you ever heard of Jawaharlal Nehru?
The name sounds familiar.
Yeah, Nehru was one of the major leaders of India's independence movement in the early 20th century. And then he went on to become the first prime minister of independent India after the British left. And he was he was prime minister through from independence in 47, I think it was 47, and then through the 1950s, and then up until the mid-late 1960s. So, it's not quite 20 years, but a very critical time period in India's history, given that was sort of the formative period for independent India's nascent political institutions. But he was a very important figure. Everybody in India knows him. Like, it's one of the top guys you learn about in Indian history. Anyway, Indira Gandhi was his daughter. And without getting into like the whole history and composition of the Indian National Congress as a political entity and party, it was originally kind of more of an umbrella organization that included people from all over India's political spectrum. And there was a lot of give and take that was done, and a lot of political negotiating, a lot of you scratch my back, I scratch yours, that kind of stuff, in order to keep all of the different political factions in the INC together, cooperating with each other. So that required a lot of deft political skill. And Indira Gandhi did not really have that. Indira Gandhi's vision for how to run the party, which she ended up doing, like Nehru died, and then there was an open question of who would succeed him. A lot of the party elite just kind of assumed it would be one of the other senior figures in the party. But Indira Gandhi wanted the job, and she had some supporters in that, and she actually outmaneuvered all of her rivals in order to gain control of the party. So that was not inevitable, but that's how it worked out. And her vision for how to lead a party as large and diverse as the Indian National Congress was to basically run it like she owned it, which is not a smart way to run an institution like that, which has such a diversity of disparate interests. And so the inevitable happened. She ran it like she owned it. She ran it basically as her personal property, and she alienated huge swaths of the party to the point where the INC transformed from this very inclusive, broad-based organization that had a presence all over India and that was very inclusive of everybody who wanted a strong, independent India into the party of Indira Gandhi. Mm-hmm. It was just her, like she was the party. And the party shifted from being sort of a normal, albeit extraordinarily large political party, to being an extended patronage network of people loyal to Gandhi. She would give people favors, money, etc., and in exchange, people in the party would give her loyalty. So corruption had always been a party in the Indian National Congress, but after Indira Gandhi took over, it got worse, much more so. Like she basically took all of the worst habits of patronage in Indian politics and used them to enscone herself as at the top of the INC. Mm-hmm. And the result was that India went through a kind of pseudo-authoritarian period. Like she actually declared a state of emergency for 2 years, during which time she was effectively dictator of India. And it was not immediately clear at the time that she was ever going to end that state of emergency. She did end up doing so, but the only reason she did is because she believed that she was genuinely popular amongst the population and would win a new election, which was duly held, and she lost because all of the people, most of whom were former members of her party, the INC, a lot of the people she alienated left, formed their own parties, and when the state of emergency ended, they all banded together into a giant political coalition of a whole variety of parties that had nothing in common other than the fact that they fucking hated Indira Gandhi. And that coalition of parties was called Janata Dal, I believe. And they were able to win that election, kick out Indira Gandhi, and restore the integrity, you might say, of India's nascent democracy.
So I'm seeing here that the main mistake, which was corrected later on, was whenever you get into a really powerful and important role as a leader, your first step should be to build some coalitions. Because if you don't, then they're going to build coalitions against you.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, to be fair to Indira, she was quite good at building coalitions, but she built them within the party, and she built them for the purpose of just ensconing herself as the party leader. Mm-hmm. She was not interested in maintaining the delicate balance of relations between all of the pre-existing coalition members. Mm-hmm. Anybody who didn't want her in charge and who opposed her vision for India was basically all but expelled from the party. Mm-hmm. So, coalitions are important, like you say, but that's pretty much true regardless of context or circumstances. But more broadly, the enlightened thing to do is to build broad-based coalitions that are based around ideas and not personalities. Mm-hmm. And that's something that a lot of developing countries really struggle with. It's all good and well to have a democracy, but as we've discussed at length on here before, democracies require more than just the rules and the laws and constitutions on which a democratic political system is constructed, or out of which they are constructed. Rather, it also needs that people observe the informal norms that maintain a liberal democracy. And so what you'll find is there's a lot of developing countries that have the former, the sort of infrastructure of a democracy, but they lack observance and respect for the norms for that democracy. Those are not recognized or respected by the politicians within the system. Mm-hmm. And the result is that they take advantage of every weakness and loophole that they can find, of which there are always going to be, right? There's always going to be ways to circumvent restrictions on the abuse of power for mm-hmm. personal enrichment. And insomuch as the West has been successful in constructing robust democratic institutions, The main reason is not just the solid design of those institutions, but also that we have been remarkably successful in passing down the perceived need to respect the norms of those institutions and respect the integrity of those institutions. And we've passed that down from generation to generation. The moment we fail to do that, the moment there comes a generation in any Western country that does not understand, or perhaps understands but does not accept the importance of respecting those norms, that's it. Like from that point on, the quality of democratic institutions, if not the political system in general, certainly the political stability will decline markedly and rapidly going forward. And it will be very difficult to repair that damage once it is done. Like nobody knows exactly how or why, cultural norms, social norms, political norms are built and how they're able to propagate. Like that's a very inexact science in academia. So the best way to fix something that you don't know how works is really not to break it in the first place. That's the best advice that you can give as far as how to maintain a liberal democracy and respect for its norms. So, if there's somebody whom is very perhaps popular and charismatic who explicitly ignores those norms for their own benefit, maybe you should not support that person, whomever they may be. Certainly, at the very least, you should be immensely skeptical. I would point out as an addendum to the stuff about India we just mentioned, Indira Gandhi actually did get back into office as prime minister. So, she was not banished from Indian politics, but she did miss out on probably 5-7 years or so, when either the Janata Dal or some other combination of parties were in power. But the INC and Indira Gandhi did come back, I think in the early 1980s. And then she continued to govern until the mid-80s when she was assassinated by her own bodyguards, as it happens.
Damn.
Yeah, she was very good at pissing people off. She kind of had that habit. There was a separatist movement in Punjab province. It's a very well-known province in India. It has a very strong personality as a culture. But one of the things that gives them that strong personality is the fact that they have their own religion, Sikhism, or Sikhism, as they would call it. And there was a separatist movement in Punjab that wanted an independent Sikh state that they called Khalistan. You might have heard about it recently. It's actually been in the news again the past couple months. But in the 1980s, this separatist movement was particularly strong and militant. And at one point, one of the radical factions in the movement actually stormed and seized control of the main holy site of the Sikh religion in the holy city of Amritsar. And the Indian government responded to that by laying siege to the holy temple. I don't remember what the name of the temple is, but the holy temple, the holiest site in Sikhism. And eventually they stormed it and just cleared it out. And, there's a bunch of people that died. It was very controversial. Like, even people that were not sympathetic to the Khalistan movement did not really like how the Indian government handled it. And the result is not inconsiderable radicalization of a number of the pro-Khalistan people. And some of those people included her own bodyguards. Again, like I said, you didn't have to be like a full-fledged separatist in order not to like the Indian government storming this holy site. And her bodyguards, who were all Sikh, which is actually not at all unusual for India through much of its history, they retaliated. Like, they literally planned to murder her and did so in retaliation for the storming of the temple at Amritsar. And that was the end of Indira Gandhi.
Why is it not uncommon for Indian bodyguards to be Sikh?
Not just bodyguards, pretty much any kind of position that involves martial prowess, soldier, bodyguard, what have you. Sikhs are invariably disproportionately represented in those kinds of jobs. They're not a majority. Keep in mind, India is huge, and the Sikh population is relatively small. But relative to their proportion of the overall population, like Sikhs are way overrepresented in institutions like the military, private security, etc. And the reason is that they have a martial tradition. They did not originally have a martial tradition. Originally, Sikhism was just like another regular sort of, not cult, that's not the word I want. There was a guru who started his own little movement. And it got popular, and eventually it kind of became self-sustaining. Like he declared a successor, etc., and then that successor had a successor. And so there's a lot of sects, in Hinduism, in India generally, that have their start like that.
Sorry, there's a lot of sects or sects?
Sects.
Okay, thank you.
Given that they have 1 billion people, probably not an inconsiderable amount of sects too, but in this case, I'm referring to sects.
Yeah, just need to clarify that one. Also, quick related question. How long until you think the dong is going to be the world currency?
The dong?
The Vietnamese dong.
Never?
Okay. Just another viewer asked that question. They're curious.
I find it highly unlikely that it'll ever be the global currency. It could be a global reserve currency in the same way that the Japanese yen or the Swiss franc could be, but Vietnam would have to do a lot of things to make that happen. That's a whole conversation unto itself about managing an economy and forex markets. Mm-hmm. We can get into that if they want, but before we do, let me try to finish this thought.
It was actually just a dick joke. We don't have to get too much into it. I think it was meant as a joke. Did you not?
Of course.
Oh.
Of course.
Well played, Old Dirty. You got him.
What is Vietnam's currency?
The Vietnamese dong.
That is, okay, that's not made up. That's what I thought.
Okay.
Okay. It sounded like a legitimate question.
My deadpan delivery worked.
Very successful. Well played. Oh, what was it? Sikhs, right, Sikhs. Yeah, it started out as just like a normal sect. And what happened is that I shouldn't say Muslims, but like Central Asian migrant Muslims invaded northern India. And when they did, they frequently came into conflict with a lot of the local religious groups, because of course Islam does not really take well to the worship of what it considers to be pagan gods of one kind or another. Very long established history of that. And when they came into conflict with the Sikhs, such as they were at the time, I want to say this would have been like the 1400s, maybe 1500s. The Muslim leadership at the time actually had the leader of the Sikh movement assassinated. He had him decapitated, if I remember correctly. And so after that, well, no, I don't think he was even the founder. I think it was one of the later gurus. Regardless, the leader of the Sikh religion at that time was decapitated. And after that, subsequent leaders went out of their way to teach their followers not only the traditional tenets of Sikhism, but also taught them that they needed to be able to defend themselves, because there was a sense that they were under siege by the new Islamic government in northern India at the time. Mm-hmm. And so the result is that there grew within the Sikh community a martial tradition. They trained themselves not only how to be, spiritually strong, but how to be physically strong and how to be good fighters. And the result in subsequent centuries is that Sikhs gained a reputation for their prowess in combat, and very frequently were recruited as mercenaries as well as to provide security. And the British in particular took this to the next level, because what happened with the British is that after the Sepoy Revolt in the 1860s, well, I should point out that before the Sepoy Revolt, most of the people manning Britain's armies in India were Bengali. But the Bengalis were identified as one of the major, as a community, like as an ethnic group, were identified as one of the main supporters of the rebellion. And so because of that, the British became very paranoid about hiring Bengalis into their army in particular, if not also their government. So after that, they started making a list, basically, of all of the groups, be they ethnic groups, tribes, castes, whomever, that they felt qualified for what they called martial races. And the martial races, again, were just anybody, any group in India that could be identified that had a martial tradition, that were considered like warriors. And the Sikhs made the list. And among the groups on the list, they were probably the largest, or at the very least one of the largest. And because the British went on to recruit heavily from these communities in order to generate soldiers for their armies, they came to disproportionately represent the soldiery in the British Raj's army. Now, there was already a martial tradition in these communities, but after the British started hiring them for their army, they doubled down on it because it became a viable career path for them. It became an avenue into the middle class, a better life than what they could get basically farming, in other words. And after that, the Sikhs became a mainstay of the British Indian military ever since, right up to the point when India became independent. But of course, when India became independent, they inherited the British Imperial Army in India. That basically just became the Army of Independent India. And they in turn inherited the disproportionate Sikh representation. Yeah, one of the things the Indian government did after it became independent was to try to recruit outside of the martial races, because there was a feeling that the Indian army was not sufficiently representative of the true diversity of India. They didn't want any group to feel left out, right? They didn't want any group to be able to complain that they were not being represented in the army and that the army might not defend them in the case of a conflict, like they were not represented in it as an institution. And they felt that necessary because just so much of the army in particular, if not the military in general, was just Sikhs and a couple other groups. That was just almost all of, that was like half of the military right there. And even today, after lots of effort to try to diversify the composition, the ethnic composition of the military in India, even now they make up something like 10 to 15% of the military, despite being like way less than that in terms of their proportion of the overall population. So that's what I mean when I say it's not unusual for Sikhs to be bodyguards, soldiers, and whatnot. Like, they have a long history of that.
Yeah, it makes sense. So their reputation started that way out of necessity, just for their own survival. If you're a startup religion, you're going to have some pushback from the established religious administration in the area. And then after that point, just kind of being perceived as such and then getting job opportunities. So that basically continued to reinforce that role for them. That makes sense. Chat also gave a shout out to the Gurkhas, I think, of Nepal.
Yeah.
People that are kind of perceived that way as very proficient fighters.
Yeah, the British still recruit them.
Mm-hmm.
They actually give them like special visa status so that they can fight with the British military. I think they have curtailed recruiting just because they've had to downsize the budget. Mm-hmm. The British economy has not been doing great over the past couple decades. So I don't think they recruit as much as they used to, but I do think they still have some.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Gurkhas in particular had a fearsome reputation. The Germans were known to be afraid of them.
Fear is a pretty big factor when it comes to war as well. So even just by hiring troops that have a certain reputation, you can already just get a mental advantage over the competition, even if their fighting quality is similar to just whatever other regular fighter you might have.
Yeah, intimidation is a very real thing.
Mm-hmm. Roll for intimidation. You know what that means now.
I've been doing that a lot more in my second playthrough.
Mm.
Because I've been playing a paladin, so there's a lot more opportunities, both in terms of better bonuses and in terms of just the role play. It makes more sense.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the class fantasy of paladin, and I'm glad that it's in Baldur's Gate as well, is if you go against your oath, you lose your powers. You need to play an Oathbreaker kind of paladin, which that's cool. It has some accountability to how you need to play. Another fun one for me, which I don't know if people know, is any character can spec into a different class. So if you're curious as to what the different companion characters might say when they're talking shit, just spec them into a bard and get them to cast cutting words at people, and they will talk shit. It's pretty funny to hear them do that.
Yeah, you mentioned that you learned that you can multi-class recently, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been staying away from that. I feel like I would go down a rabbit hole from whence I would not emerge.
It's probably wise, because I pretty much got stuck in the story once I figured out you could do that. And I was just like, well, I'll just respec one more time because it's only 100 gold.
Yeah, pretty affordable. But yeah, there's endless combinations.
Mm-hmm.
So I could definitely see how you could get enthralled with it. No pun intended.
Yep. I'm actually going to try my hand at dungeon mastering for the first time during the subathon. I haven't ever been a dungeon master before. Yeah, I've been a player in quite a few different campaigns now, so I more or less know how to play, and I think I know what the rules are. And I was talking with some other dungeon masters about it, and apparently a lot of what happens, you just kind of bullshit as it comes up, which I didn't know. Because if a dungeon master is very charismatic and they know the game well, they can flex into a lot of different situations and basically improv what they think would happen in a way that makes it completely believable to the players. So that gave me a lot of courage in setting mine up. I do have a lot of written material for mine, just so I have a baseline story to go off of. But some of the best moments in both film and this kind of narrative tabletop game is whenever you go off the beaten path. Maybe you talk to an NPC or you do something that you didn't expect and kind of have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, it's very cool. Unfortunately, I'm terrible at it. Yeah, not even just being dungeon master, just playing Dungeons and Dragons at all. I was just very bad at it. So kudos to you for expanding your horizons.
Why do you think you're bad at it?
Oh, there's no question I was bad at it.
Oh.
I could never remember the rules. I was really bad about staying within like the role play. I didn't understand when we started that you're kind of supposed to take the lead of the dungeon master. Like, it's not like an open world RPG where you just do whatever you want. Like, it is kind of more linear than that, and I didn't get that. So I kind of broke that norm and aggravated all of my friends. So yeah, I was sufficiently embarrassed by the experience that I never came back, and probably never will.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the dynamic of the group, what they expect and things as well. Two of the players that I'm hosting in the one-shot, which I'm not doing a full campaign, I'm just doing a single session just to kind of make my job easier as getting into it for the first time. We have two people who are relatively new, so I'm not going to make stuff extremely difficult. And when you start with level 1 players, it's easier to remember stuff. And I would wager that you are now a much better D&D player after playing Baldur's Gate, because it has pretty much the same rules. The only main difference is you can't yeet a potion into someone's mouth from a distance. That's usually something that DMs are very grouchy about when they see you can do that. They're like, what? You can throw this potion and it lands on 2 fallen people and they both get up? That's super broken and probably won't happen in your actual D&D. But aside from that, there are a lot of things that are very kind of one-to-one the same between 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and Baldur's Gate. Chat, you can roast me or disagree if you want to. I won't be upset.
Have you ever heard of tyranny?
Yes, that would be when a leader is exploiting their follower. You mean like a game or something?
Sorry, I guess I should have been more specific. Yeah, it's a game and it uses the rule system for Dungeons and Dragons. It's I actually had played that before I played Baldur's Gate 3. And one of the reasons I found Baldur's Gate 3 relatively easy to learn, at least at the start, was because it was so similar to Tyranny. So, if you, obviously you like Dungeons and Dragons, but if you like Baldur's Gate 3 specifically, that manifestation of Dungeons and Dragons, definitely give Tyranny a try. It's got a very strong story, and it's relatively short. Like, you're not going to spend 200 whatever hours playing Tyranny. It's kind of more of like a 30 to 40 hour thing. Yeah, a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun with that, so strong recommend from me.
Nice.
I guess we did have some questions. Do we have time? Like, it's a little bit late.
Yeah, we got time.
Okay.
Like 30 minutes for questions or so.
We really blew through today, didn't we?
Yeah. Takes a long time to talk about farming.
Hopefully not too boring for people. Well, let's see. Do you have any insight on why the VA has such a poor reputation, deserved or otherwise? I mean, it's like a lot of heavily bureaucratic healthcare systems.
Clarification, Veterans Affairs.
Yeah. For those of you not familiar with what the VA is, the VA is, somewhat ironically, a national healthcare service in the United States that is available only to veterans. And it's not even like veterans of wars. It's just military personnel. Either people serving in the military or people who used to serve in the military have access to the VA. And it is nominally free. I think you do have to pay premiums regardless. Like, there are insurance premiums you have to pay, but they're relatively affordable, as I understand it, compared to most private sector options. But the problem with the VA the problems with the VA are pretty similar to the problems you would see with any, state-run healthcare system, which is that they tend to be very bureaucratic, relatively inefficient, especially with things like paperwork. I don't know if you guys remember Jon Stewart. He was, it's an older audience, right? They must remember him.
Please don't call them older. That's going to make them upset.
Hey, with age comes wisdom. It's no problem. But Jon Stewart, besides being like a comedian and hosting The Daily Show, he also kind of made a name for himself by trying to push politicians to reform the VA and become more efficient. And the reason he did that is specifically because the VA had such a bad reputation with regard to things like response times, scheduling appointments, stuff like that. But beyond the administrative side of the VA, the overall quality of the care that people get is decent. And, your mileage will vary, right? It kind of depends what kind of condition you have, what you're trying to get treated for. My understanding, and, chat can correct me on this, as they will, but my understanding is that for simpler maladies, things that are not as difficult to treat, it does much better. If all you want to do is just get treated for an infection, or if you have some chronic condition, something like that, you'll probably be okay. But if you have something more complicated, something like cancer or what have you, then you can experience more problems. Especially if it's something that requires like specialists, eye surgery or something, maybe then you might have more problems. But again, mileage will vary. You could get, you could get the opposite of what I said. If you have something complicated, you could end up really happy with your care. And if you have something simple, you could be very upset with your care. It just varies considerably. So, the poor reputation is not entirely deserved. It's not terrible, but it definitely has its problems. And, you could say that of any healthcare system or even any insurance company. There's always going to be there's always going to be people who are upset with what they get in terms of care, service, etc. But the VA does have certain issues that go beyond what you would expect from just like a regular private sector company, or even necessarily a peer healthcare system run by the state in another developed country. So certainly there are a lot of issues to be worked out there, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be either.
So it seems like a mixed bag.
Yeah, yeah, that is my understanding of it from what I've heard from people who have used it.
Well, you'll have fun reading the chat whenever I can post this VOD, which it'll be late, assuming the subathon goes on for a bit, because I can't publish a VOD until it's concluded. But you have multiple people in the chat who are kind of weighing in because they have experience in dealing with Veterans Affairs. So thank you, chat, for sharing your firsthand accounts with
Yeah.
that. Old Dirty says the VA is far better at treating large acute issues, and they're bad at
Oh,
treating chronic issues.
oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, so this viewer had cancer, and as soon as it was confirmed, they were under the knife in less than 72 hours, but all the treatment was top notch. Nice. So
Okay.
if your issue is big and immediate, it seems like they'll take care of you, but if it's a smaller chronic issue, then it's hard to get them to help you out.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I would take their word at it. Because I myself never served in the military, so I've never used it myself. My own experience is more just with relatives who have used it. And overall, they were pretty positive. Yeah, I don't think I've done the usual disclaimer yet. I should have done it earlier. I'm not an expert at everything. I'm not an expert about everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. And I do appreciate the feedback we get. And, this is an excellent example of the kind of cool feedback we want on here. So thank you for participating. Further participation is encouraged.
Yeah, we have another person who went through VA, and they said that they had tapeworms, and the doctor was using Google Translate because they didn't even speak English. So you could roll very low on your doctor, potentially. Someone who doesn't really help you out too much at all.
Yeah.
That's a pretty, I think, good example of the United States healthcare in general, though, is that we have the full range of the very best doctors in the world to like malpractice. So it really depends. And ours is, I think, considered to be relatively good, but extremely cost prohibitive compared to other countries in Europe that say have single payer health or it's provided by their government.
Kind of. Like when people talk about the cost of American healthcare, they're looking at total costs. And that's not necessarily the best way to measure outcomes. The bigger problem is that it's just that access is very uneven. Like we do have some of the best healthcare in the world, but if you're just like a regular guy working 9 to 5, good luck getting any of it. Yeah, I think it's expensive for the regular guy in terms of things like premiums and in terms of drugs, prescriptions, whatnot. Yeah, it is much more expensive in that regard than equivalents in other countries. So certainly in that regard, it's more expensive. But it's even more expensive if you look at total expenditure. And again, that's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison because the US healthcare system does things very differently than in the European healthcare system. One case in point, in Europe, there is frequently, certainly in the NHS in the UK, where it's like totally fucking nationalized, which is actually pretty unusual. In most European healthcare systems, there is a cutoff point. Like even if you can pay for further care, if your condition deteriorates to a certain point, they will, based off of a cost-benefit analysis, actually just cut you off from further care. And that's pretty controversial, like even over there a lot of the time, but in general it's accepted because it can be very expensive. Like it's possible to keep somebody alive for a very long time, even if their condition is very bad, but their quality of life tends to be very poor. And the end is still inevitable. You're basically just delaying the inevitable. And to do that, it takes a lot of money. It tends to be very expensive. And a lot of governments, especially in Europe, are relatively cash strapped. Like, they are on a budget. They can't afford to just spray gobs of money, on issues like this. And so they do have to ration a bit. And one of the ways they ration is by doing it like this, where they have that cutoff point. We don't really have that here in the United States. Here in the US, if you've got the money, you're going to get the care. So even if it means, making somebody you love just suffer for an extra 6 months to a year with no discernible gain in terms of their quality of life and with no change in the inevitable outcome, like again, they're going to die. The hospital will indulge you if you can pay for the treatment. And the result of that is that overall costs in the American healthcare system are much inflated. Because again, in Europe, they don't have that, so that's just cut off. But in America, we do. And so we get all of this extra spending by family members who just don't want to be the one to like cut them off. Because it feels like you're killing them. Like that's the bottom line.
Yeah, you can empathize with that. It's a really hard decision.
Yeah, nobody wants to be the guy to say, everybody loves grandpa, but maybe we need to wrap this up. Because he's not going to get better. He doesn't feel good, obviously. So, maybe we need to seriously consider a different path forward. Like that, nobody wants to be that guy.
Yeah.
Right. And so, unless you just don't have the resources to do it, a lot of families will just continue on for as long as the hospital can keep them alive. And, regardless of the ethics of that, just in terms of cost, it adds a significant amount of cost to the overall healthcare expenditures in the United States. So for that reason alone, that is a major reason why there's major differences in terms of overall healthcare costs. If you want another example of why it's so different in total, there's the fact that Americans are just, they tend to make unhealthy choices more frequently than their European counterparts, which is a really polite, politically correct way of saying Americans tend to be fat asses. Not morbidity, obesity in the United States is much higher than peer countries, in the developed world. The UK kind of comes close. Maybe that's an Anglo-Saxon thing, but in the US, like obesity is much worse. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Some of them are environmental, cultural. You've got factors like food deserts. There's incentives. Like there's all manner of different factors. But the bottom line is that people are not making good choices. There's a greater propensity to make bad health choices in the United States. And regardless of the reasons for that, one of the ways that manifests is greater spending in the healthcare system, because you're much more likely to get some kind of illness related to obesity. That is to say, the incidence of illnesses related to obesity are invariably much higher in the United States, and that invariably means greater spending on those maladies. And presumably, if people were not obese, or at least if the obesity rate were less, you would not have that same incidence of those illnesses, and spending would be lower. So just health consciousness and the degree to which people take care of themselves is not like at the same level in the United States as it is elsewhere. And again, the reasons why are, an interesting conversation unto themselves, but, we're talking narrowly here about overall healthcare cost. So that also inflates that overall headline number in the United States. It makes it look bigger than it would if it were an actual apple-to-apple comparison. Like if you controlled for these things, if you did allow people to spend money as much as they wanted to keep their family members alive in Europe, or if Europeans had similarly shit health as Americans do, you might see similar outcomes in terms of overall expenditures.
Yeah, some examples that Chad is sharing for reasons for maybe a better health level in the EU is the EU bans a lot of stuff that they consider to be unhealthy, whereas in the US there are a lot of products, I would say especially like the pretty cracked energy drinks and stuff that are jammed with sugar and stimulants and stuff. Their threshold for banning those is much lower. And then in addition to that, I think the general culture of Americans doing hurry up in terms of their career and putting their career before their health, that was a big cultural surprise for our family whenever we moved to the south of France. where their culture is very much, let's sit down and have a 2.5 to 3 hour conversation over a meal
Yeah.
instead of let me slam pack Taco Bell in 20 minutes and then go back to work. And those are very different strains on the human body. Like, even if it's the same amount of food, you distribute it over a long time period. Even if it was Taco Bell over 3 hours, if it's the same amount of food, that would still be less of a burden. So yeah, we're very much a go get 'em when it comes to that. And we don't really like taking the time for a long lunch. And a lot of times when people do want to take a long lunch, we immediately assume that that person is lazy and they're trying to get out of work, rather than they're maybe prioritizing their health physically and mentally, and they want to make sure that they show up to work more focused and prepared. We have very much a like clock in, clock out, you want to max your hours kind of a mindset here. So I think it's a conversation that we're getting better at improving at. Like, we're gradually talking about these food choices that we make. I actually saw on lots of different menus, it'll show the calorie count of different food items and that kind of thing. So we are becoming relatively more informed about our food choices, but anyone who's seen any food documentary knows that the companies that produce this food have a heavy incentive to get you to buy that food, even if it isn't good for you.
Yeah.
And as a recent young budding vegan, one of the things that I've talked to Trisha a lot about is that meat as a food item was historically and prehistorically speaking like a lucky treat that you would get sometimes, or something that you had because you lived in an area where you couldn't farm and pick berries and plant stuff. Like, you're in a fishing village in Alaska. Yes, you have to eat a lot of meat, but relative to wealthy people, poor people, generally speaking, would have to have more grains and veggies, and they couldn't have the boar or the steak or whatever, that kind of stuff, or the deer that someone would have to hunt. So we're basically being given a very huge calorie excess for a relatively low dollar amount for what we earn. And that decision-making process isn't really taught to people in school. Like, I don't think I ever took any useful diet class in elementary, middle, or high school. We had like one health class in high school, which was a joke because the teachers didn't want to teach it and the students didn't want to be there. So it was kind of just like a homeroom, basically.
Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons why healthcare would be more expensive here. That's a whole thing. And there's also the middlemen in the American healthcare system are just awful. That's one of the worst regulated aspects of the American healthcare system. That's a whole topic too. But yeah, there's a variety of reasons, but we don't have much time left, so I'm going to kind of skip ahead. If I don't get the gist of the question, please feel free to ask again. I'm happy to return to it. You know, I'm not the smartest guy, so sometimes I misread a question or whatever. We probably won't have time to get back to it today, but I'd be happy to return to it later, the next time we do this. Could you explain to someone with no knowledge in economics what are the Keynesian ideas? I'm trying to understand why Javier Milei says he wants to kick the crap out of them. Thanks. That's a big question. Keynesian economics is like a whole it's a whole field of economics. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Basically, Keynesian economics was a field of macroeconomics that was created by a guy named Keynes, a British economist teaching in London. And he was part of a rising tide in the field of economics generally in the early 20th century that was trying to find was trying to understand the economy in a more mechanical way. You know, they kept trying to find and build models that could summarize, economic activity in a modern economy in a way that would allow policymakers to take specific actions in order to stimulate it or otherwise change it in a way that was desirable, be it inhibiting inflation, increasing employment, increasing output, whatever. And Keynes was basically like the winner. He was the guy who was able to revolutionize the field and create a model, the Keynesian sort of vision for the macroeconomy. And macroeconomics has changed a lot since then, since the 1920s and 30s when he was in his heyday. But a lot of the bare bones are still there. You've probably seen at some point journalists describe the economy as consisting of government spending plus overall investment plus overall consumption plus net exports. So that's a very basic model, but that was actually created by Keynes and was part of the foundation of his Keynesian ideas. So we still use that today as just a kind of shorthand, a kind of heuristic by which to understand roughly the composition of a national economy. Again, it's evolved past that by now. There's been successive revelations and revolutions in the field of economics that have progressed thinking, but we still use some of his original ideas like that model, just as kind of a quick and easy back of the envelope type way to understand activity. Anyway, that's roughly what Keynesian economics was originally. And again, it was largely made to kind of justify and rationalize government intervention in the economy. And so it's associated in the broader politics, in the world of politics with left-wing politics. Generally Keynesianism is associated with state intervention in the economy, and so conservative economists, and especially just conservatives generally, tend to be pretty skeptical of it. And even in the field of economics, there was plenty of criticism from conservative economists, especially from Hayek, who was actually a contemporary of Keynes at the time. Fun story, both Keynes and Hayek actually taught at the same university for a time during World War II, and they were actually given the same shift to patrol, I think it was either the university or that famous church in London. I forget which it was, but they actually spent time together on patrol, trying to watch for fires, because the Germans were, dropping incendiary devices during the Blitz. And so they were supposed to try to prevent those from, just burning down their building. And so they spent a lot of time talking together in London at that period. So just fun fact. Regardless, Hayek and other sort of more conservative, generally Austrian economists were very much opposed to his perspective on, the economy, how it worked, and appropriate policy measures with which to deal with it. But Keynesianism was such a revelation, and it was considered so useful that it ended up being the dominant form of economics, especially with regard to policy issues for much of the early 20th century, pretty much all of the mid-20th century, and even now is still pretty influential, although now neo-Keynesianism is actually more relevant. Yeah, the 70s kind of killed Keynesianism. There was so much weird shit happening at the time that the field really had to make significant changes to kind of understand and incorporate the fact that a lot of traditional models were no longer functioning as predicted. But before that, Keynesianism was easily dominant. So there are two ways to think about Keynesian economics. The way Dagnip here, I know Dagnip by now, the way Dagnip is asking about it is more the political understanding. And the political understanding, both in the United States and abroad, is that Keynesianism is leftism. It is a sort of a socialist way of managing an economy where the state intervenes and tries to boost demand or mitigate unemployment, or otherwise just make sure that the good things the economy is doing are maximized, and then the bad things, the trade-offs, are minimized. So again, it's a very mechanical way of viewing an economy. It's almost like how an engineer would view a car. The car is underperforming, so you need to make this, that, or the other change in order to maximize and optimize performance. So that's more the political view. Obviously, conservatives, all across the Western world, don't like that because they prefer less state intervention. But in terms of economics, by contrast, Keynesianism is viewed a little bit differently. It is still viewed as being kind of more inherently statist and more proactive in terms of state intervention. But it's also seen as a very technical way of trying to understand the economy, and sort of that technical way of trying to model an economy and to try to create a model that has both theoretical coherence and quantitative predictive power is still a major mainstay of the way that economists try to research and understand the economy. So even economists that prefer less state intervention will often still take a quantitative approach to building models and trying to test models. Keynesianism kind of died out a little bit in the 1970s, but corresponding with that was a quantitative revolution in the field of economics, which really put much greater emphasis on the quantitative side, the quantitative analysis that corresponded with that Keynesian economics helped pioneer. The quantitative revolution in the 70s took it to the next level, and qualitative analysis has kind of taken a hit as a result. And the field is a little bit lesser for it, but the quantitative revolution did serve to make the field much, much more rigorous. And that was it was in need of that. It was very helpful. And it did serve to help kind of deal with some of the dogmatism in the field that was prevalent at the time. Anyway, he's not asking about a history of economics, so I'll restrain myself. But, that roughly, again, this is like the short version of what Keynesian ideas in economics is. Mm-hmm. So that's why Milei, the recently elected president of Argentina, is talking about wanting to kick the crap out of Keynesian ideas, because those ideas are seen as left-wing statist interventionist ideas. And Milei, of course, is famously a libertarian that wants to minimize state intervention in the economy. So his idea of economic management is probably going to correspond much more tightly with Austrian economics, which is a lot more laissez-faire and is sort of the bedrock for the kind of thinking propagated by guys like Milton Friedman, who is kind of a different type of economist. He's more of a monetarist economist, but monetarists are basically a subspecies of Austrian economists. So they're tightly related, even though they're a little bit different in the specifics. So that's probably that kind of economics, the Austrian school, is almost certainly what Milei has in mind as far as economic policy making.
Makes sense. So it represents a historical and main opponent of his, rather than specifically breaking down all the tenets of it. It represents leftism and statism.
Yeah, that's the popular perception. Mm-hmm. Let's see. We've got more questions, but I don't want to force you to stay up.
Oh, it's all good. You can take a couple more.
Okay. Can you list some democratic countries in which society had problems respecting democratic norms, and were they unable to recover those norms? I guess, and whether they were able to recover those norms. Some cynical creatures might argue the United States is such an example. Whether or not those norms can be recovered remains to be determined. So stay tuned. As usual, the United States is the most interesting TV show on the air right now. But as far as countries that have already gone through this, it's hard to find countries where liberal democracy became the mainstay of the political culture and which were able to successfully fully implement liberal democratic norms. It's not uncommon, for example, in Latin America, for liberal democracy to be the dominant political ideology, pretty much all over the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. Liberal democracy is the only real legitimate form of government. But, as anybody familiar with Latin America can tell you, mileage may vary. Not every democracy is created equally. Canada and the United States have done a very good job over their history, recent shenanigans notwithstanding, building and propagating liberal democratic norms in their political culture. But a lot of countries in places like Central America especially have really struggled to get political elites to observe and respect liberal democratic norms. But you cannot say that they lost them, because a lot of them never really had them in the first place. So those are not really good examples of what this person is asking about. So I think I would really struggle to find examples where democratic norms were strong at one point and then became weak. There's not a lot of cases like that. Maybe somebody in chat can remember something I can't remember off the top of my head, but I don't think I can think of any such examples. Yeah, this is actually one of the cornerstones of democratic peace theory, which is a little bit different, but the idea behind democratic peace theory is that democracies don't go to war with each other. But the trouble, the flaw with the theory is that we only have like 200 some years, not even that really, it's more like 150 years where there's been any significant number of democracies around the world. So the sample size is vanishingly small. And so that really kind of limits the degree to which you can really infer conclusions from that data set. If you want to infer strong conclusions, you need a large data set. And there's just not enough history. There's not enough liberal democracies that we can look at through history to kind of draw conclusions in that regard. So similarly to that issue, the problem with trying to find examples here of countries that have lost them is that there just haven't been very many to lose them in the first place. And so I'm not really thinking of any examples then that I can use. So unless somebody can think of an example that I'm not thinking of, I'm thinking the answer is none. There have not been any that have lost them. Again, recent shenanigans notwithstanding. And in turn, there have not been any that have recovered them that I know of. And again, I'm focusing here on modern liberal democracies. If you want to kind of loosen the definition of liberal democratic norms, you could probably find more in that regard. But as far as if we're looking at norms defined as the norms that you would see in a developed modern country, no, I don't think there's been any yet. Knock on wood. Let's see. Okay, so how do you think the incidents in the US and Canada regarding Indians killing and planning to kill Sikhs will affect the long-term relationships? Long story short, it won't. Because the relationship is predicated a lot more on China as a common enemy. And I suspect both governments are going to prioritize that over and above the recent shenanigans. You remember this, right, Neuro, how the Indian government was accused of trying to assassinate Sikh separatists in Canada?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the past week it came out that the US government had discovered a similar plot that was going to happen in the United States itself. So this issue is continuing to escalate then. Also, the recent news must have been a big relief to Justin Trudeau, because there was a lot of people saying that he was lying about it, or at least misrepresenting it. So for the US government to come out and say, oh yeah, we found a similar plot here, that's not bullshit, that helps him significantly.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that is a problem. Certainly Washington is not going to appreciate foreign governments assassinating people on its own territory. So that is going to be a thorn in the relationship. But I don't think the US government is going to break relations over it. What it's going to do instead is almost certainly just apply pressure in other areas. So it may limit the supply of visas that it gives to Indian students or workers. There might be some tariffs somewhere. Biden hasn't really been big on tariffs, but if there is some area where the Indian government is engaging in shenanigans, there could be some, I forget the name of it, but there is a special emergency power the president has that can slap short-term tariffs on goods that are believed by the president to be taking market share from American producers in the American market because of an unfair competitive advantage stemming from something like illegal government subsidies from their home government. So that could happen, but it's probably going to be done quietly regardless of how the Biden administration deals with it. And I suspect that's going to be the preferred option for all governments involved. It might seem strange that the US government would be quiet about something as serious as a violation of its sovereignty, but given that the country responsible is India, and given India's importance to overall American strategy in the Indo-Pacific, you can expect the US government to handle them with kid gloves, which is probably not going to be great as far as deterring future such intransigences. But when it comes to grand strategy, you tend to have to make your trade-offs, frequently unpalatable trade-offs, and this is likely to be one of them, I suspect. Let's see, how long until the AI killer robots from the Replicator project trickles down to the local law enforcement and the police state of the USA?
That's what the movie Chappie is about. They're police robots in South Africa, though, not the U.S.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with the Replicator project, so I would have to look it up. So I can't really answer that. So my apologies. That's not a satisfactory answer, but unfortunately, that's the best I can do. I'll do more research, and if you want to ask again next week, I can try to give you an answer. But until I read about it, there's not much I can say.
I just Googled it. The U.S.-China AI contest. The race is on to deploy killer robots. Who could deploy killer robots first?
Yeah, it's going to happen soon. China already built an integrated defense network that they call Skynet.
Man, why?
That's what I said.
Yeah.
They either haven't seen Terminator or they're really big fans.
We want to take a very authoritarian tone with this operation. Guys, I don't know if you know, but they were the bad guys.
Yeah.
Oh.
But thank you for the tip. I look forward to reading about it. There's plenty I miss in a given news week. Can't read everything.
I appreciate you breaking things down for us. That was one of the things I was talking with some friends at Thanksgiving about, was how you have a passion for just finding and absorbing good quality information, and how a lot of people, I think, wish that their natural drive gave them something that people would consider a useful body of knowledge or skill with their leisure time. It's really cool that you look stuff up, and that doesn't mean that he knows everything about the world. So thank you, chat, for giving us the corrections and the scathing reviews when they're earned. But it is a cool hobby to have, and I don't know anyone else who browses news to this extent. At least I would say high quality news. There are definitely a lot of people who will stare at TV news and watch all of the sexy people yell about existing prejudice. But for someone to read articles, that's pretty cool.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate that people get something out of it. I know I get something out of it. The feedback is always good. And I appreciate the corrections. It's a good opportunity to learn as well as to share information. So, I appreciate it even more than you do, basically.
I don't know. I get hassled a lot if you're going to be on. It'll be Sunday and I'll forget, and it'll be like, Agent Smith, is he confirmed? Is he on? Is he on? It's like, I haven't even thought about that or texted him, but thank you for the reminder. We're pretty easygoing.
Hopefully I don't make too much of an ass out of myself on here.
No. You're great, and you're very brave for willing to share your perspectives with the world. Because there are a lot of people who will yell at you regardless of what your opinion is.
Oh, I know. I've seen the comments on our YouTube videos.
Yeah. I see you as a relatively neutral person overall, which is fun for me because most people I know, they really want to go to bat for a side, because that gives them a sense of belonging and purpose. And usually a side of a political spectrum is going to have some clear goals in mind. And I don't really know what your goals are. I know you go to bat for faith in institutions and respecting established norms and building coalitions. That's all really cool stuff, which no one talks about that on the news. It's what we need to do better. So it's a refreshing take. I've not once heard anyone on either a leftist or a right-leaning news outlet say that people need to build more coalitions. Has that sentence ever occurred? No. Faith in institutions? No. People don't want to have faith in institutions. Businesses are scary. But if you think about the legacy of an institution, that can last centuries longer than an individual. So the example we had today was the nice lady in India who decided that when she was going to lead, she was going to make the political party about herself and how to enscone her power, which is a short-term solution. The long-term solution is to see, hey, I'm the person with the baton in this relay race right now, and I want to make sure my lap is a good one so that when I hand it off to the next person, it's going to be an even stronger position than how I left it, which that does take some selflessness and vision, which is hard to do.
Yeah, well said. Every institution should be so lucky to have such people, but unfortunately it is a rare quality.
Mm-hmm.
she gave the control of the party over to her son. After that was the plan. She was grooming her son Sanjay, who was kind of considered a bit of a psycho. He died in a car crash, and her other son ended up being groomed for the job as a result, which was unfortunate for him because he just wanted to be an airline pilot. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. But he kind of got pulled out of his preferred profession to come and serve in that role. And he ended up inheriting the job from his mother. And it was kind of sad because he actually ended up getting assassinated too. Man. It was about, I think it was like 1990 or so. He was actually assassinated by the Tamil Tigers. I don't know if you remember them.
Oh, yeah. They're easy to remember because that's one of the rare examples of angry Buddhists.
Okay. Well, no, the Tamil Tigers were not Buddhist.
Oh.
Actually, they were fighting against the Buddhists. The government forces, the majority population were the Buddhists.
Gotcha.
And they could be very angry. So you've got the right country, but the wrong side.
Okay. It was just an angry situation there.
Yeah. Yeah, the Tamil Tigers were actually Hindu, for the record. Interestingly enough. But yeah, he died. He was assassinated by the Tamil Tigers. And so his wife ended up in control of the party. Which was especially weird because she was from Italy. There was some nationalist grumbling about that. Why is an Italian lady leading one of our major parties? That's not supposed to happen. But they had enough of a lock on power in the party to just make it work. Yeah, her name was Sonia Gandhi, and she's actually still alive, I think. She ran the party for a long time, but she continued to make the same mistake. Just running the party into the ground with like patronage and corruption. So the party is almost dead at this point. Like it doesn't even have very many seats at the national level anymore. And so how do you fix that, Neuro? Well, obviously you groom your son to succeed you.
Nepotism.
Yep, nepotism. And her son does not seem that interested in the job. I really get the impression he would rather be doing something else. Yeah, this is why monarchy doesn't work, right? You can have a strong leader at one point, but there's no guarantee his descendants will have that same strength.
Yeah, you will eventually have a weak or evil descendant.
Yeah.
Or ill. Though I guess there's just too many random variables to have one consistent family line be the ruling faction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the Gandhis definitely kind of exemplify that, unfortunately for India. I'm sorry, I went off on a wild-ass tangent there. You were trying to wrap up.
That's fun. It's all good. Well, appreciate you coming on as always, and thank you everyone for supporting Neuro Subathon 3. I'll take a break here and then get back to it, but thank you for your expertise as always. The video is being recorded, so I can just upload that to YouTube. So you'll see the YouTube upload of this probably before the VOD itself is published. But thank you once again, Agent Smith, for teaching us about the world.
Hey, my pleasure, man. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
See ya. GG. Nice. Clap.